the bell icon to turn on notifications.
We've made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
So what exactly are pivot tables and why are they so useful? Well, effectively, pivot tables are an interactive way of quickly summarizing large amounts of data. So what exactly do we mean by that? Well, we live in a very data-driven world. Lots of us are collecting data from all different sources to enable us to make better business decisions. And whilst we might be gathering all of this lovely data in a big old Excel spreadsheet, simply by looking at your data, it doesn't particularly highlight to you key metrics, issues, successes, failures, or trends. So we effectively need a way to take these large amounts of data and make sense of them. And that is where pivot tables come in. So let's take a look at an example. I have a data set here. If I press Control down arrow, the last row is 14,412. So it's a reasonably sizable data set. And this is sales data for different regions and different countries. I can see the region, the country, the item type, the sales channel, so whether that was an offline or online sale. I can see the order priority, the order date, the unique order ID number, the ship date, and then I have the number of units sold, the unit price, the unit cost, total revenue, total cost, and then finally total profit. So this is basically transactional data. Now currently this is just sitting in an Excel table in my worksheet. And if you're not sure what an Excel table is and why they're important, we're definitely going to get onto that when we build our pivot tables. But for now, just know that this data is inside an Excel table. And simply by looking at this data, it's quite hard for me to see the wood from the trees. So for example, if I wanted to know what the top 10 countries were in terms of total profit, I can't really see that too clearly simply by looking at this data. What if I want to see how many orders we've had that are high priority? Again, quite difficult for me to see. I could possibly use my filter drop-downs and eventually get to the answer that way, but what's going to be much more efficient is by putting this information into a pivot table. And the difference between a regular Excel table and a pivot table is that pivot tables are dynamic. So let me show you what I mean. So this right here is a very basic pivot table that I've built based off of that data. And what this pivot table is showing me are the top 10 countries by the number of units sold. And currently I have this list organized alphabetically. Now if I just quickly do a sort on the units, I'm going to say largest to smallest, I can now see that Croatia sold the most amount of units. Now, if at this stage I decide that I want to do a different type of analysis on this data, so maybe I'm like, okay, Croatia is top of the pile here. I want to take a look at what this looks like if we do sum of profit. Well, the cool thing with pivot tables is that they are dynamic. So simply by moving around some fields, I can get to a different set of analysis. So I'm going to get rid of units sold. And this time I'm going to do total profit, drop that into values, and now I can see all of the countries by the sum of their total profit. I can sort these largest to smallest, and I can see who the top of the pile is now. I could add in other fields, so if I wanted to see this analysis broken down in a different way, I could maybe drop item type into columns, and now I can see the different categories, departments, whatever you want to call them, summarized by the country. And again, I can see the sum of the total profit. If this is too overwhelming for me, I might want to apply some filters and maybe just filter for the top 5 countries to make this data set a little bit more manageable. Now, obviously, we're going to go through all of these things. I've just very quickly shown you there an overview of how pivot tables work. But hopefully you're starting to get the idea that pivot tables are very different from something like this, which is just a static Excel table. We can't switch this data around. We can't pivot fields around, so it makes it very difficult to analyze. Once we've got our data into a pivot table and we can pivot it in all different ways, we could create more pivot tables and we can then start to create pivot charts based off of the pivot table data. And this then opens up a whole world of visual analysis options, because most people find it a lot easier to analyze and interpret data if you give them something visual. And charts are fantastic for doing that type of thing. So you can see here I have my pivot table data, which I've actually got grouped, and then I've created a pivot chart based off this data to show the units sold by sales channel 2014 to 2017. And I have a nice line chart underneath. Once we really start getting into our pivot tables and our pivot charts, we might want to work up towards creating something like an interactive dashboard. Now, we're not going to cover this in this beginner's course, but I would say if this is something that interests you, we do have a really good interactive dashboards training course on Simon Says It, and also an advanced pivot tables course where we cover creating dashboards. But this is an example of the kind of thing that you can achieve. A dashboard showing all of the key metrics that contains things like filters to allow you to interact with the data and really pull out of it the results that you're interested in. So that is what a pivot table is, a dynamic interactive way of summarizing large amounts of data. And they're useful because they help us analyze large data sets in a clear and effective way. So let's start out this first section by talking about how we can clean up data prior to analyzing it with a pivot table. Now, if you've never heard of the term cleaning data, it basically refers to the process, in this case, the different processes in Excel that we can use to tidy up data sets, make them consistent, format them correctly, and effectively present the data in a way that a pivot table can easily analyze and produce accurate results. Because the consequences of skipping over this step, and there is always a tendency to download a data set and then immediately try and analyze it, it's very important to run through this cleaning process every time you receive a new set of data. This is of particular importance if you're downloading your data from a third party or an external source or maybe a database. Data doesn't always import into Excel in the format that we're expecting or hoping. So whilst the data that you're importing might look like it's all organized in a nice table in Access, when you import it into Excel, you might find that you have columns all over the place. Maybe you've got some strange formatting included in the data. Maybe there are blank rows, blank cells that you need to take care of so that your pivot table is going to be accurate. And what I'm going to do over the next few lessons is really run through the entire process of cleaning this data set. So we're going to see many techniques in action that you can use on any data set. It doesn't have to be this one specifically, which should ensure that you end up with a really nice clean looking data set ready for analysis. So if we take a quick look at the data that we're going to be cleaning, this is in the Sales Analysis Workbook. And as we've said, we have sales information for different regions and different countries. Now, this is a rather contrived example. I've simply messed up this data set so that we can clean it. But what you'll notice immediately is that we have some inconsistencies in column B with regards to the case. We have some words that are in italics, some words that are in bold. We have some fill colors in the cell background for some of these cells. I can also see that we have a few random blank rows throughout our data, and there might also be some duplicate entries. I don't know without going through the entire data set. Now, all of these things, if you were to leave your data as it is now, is going to make any analysis that you do inaccurate. So that's why it's so important to clean your data first. So now we understand why it's important to clean data. Let's move on to the next lesson and the subsequent lessons where we're going to go through the steps that you need to take in order to clean data in Excel. In this first section of the course, we're going to be focusing on cleaning data. And we've already discussed the reasons why it's so important to clean your data prior to putting it into a pivot table and analyzing it. So let's dive straight into the first skill we need to learn, and that is removing blank rows from our dataset. Now, if you take a look at my dataset on the screen, you can see that I have a number of blank rows in my data, and this is definitely something that can occur, particularly if you're importing your dataset in from another system or maybe another spreadsheet or downloading it off the web. Now, why are blank rows a problem? Well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they make your data harder to read if you have these random blank rows running throughout it. And secondly, they're going to cause a little bit of an issue once you create your pivot table. And just to illustrate that point, I've quickly created a pivot table just based on the data how it is, so you can see how blank rows affect that pivot table. So if we jump across to sheet 1, take a look here. Now we are jumping ahead a little bit. I haven't yet showed you how to create a pivot table, but the thing I want to draw your attention to here is at the bottom of our pivot table, we have an entry that says blank. And this entry just here is basically those blank rows that it's picking up from the original source data. So anything further that I do with this, maybe if I decide to create a chart, we're going to have this kind of blank field in there, not really doing anything or being particularly useful. It's just kind of getting in the way. So a much better idea is to remove those blank rows from your data prior to analyzing. Now, before we actually jump in and remove these blank rows, there is one thing I want to do first, and that is widen out some of these columns. As you can see, if we take a look at column A, the region is kind of cut off. There isn't enough room in that column to completely accommodate the text within it. And the same thing for some of these other columns. If you ever see these little hash marks, or a fence as they're sometimes referred to, this just shows you that there isn't enough room in that cell to accommodate the values. So we want to deal with that straight away, and it's a very simple process. We just need to widen out these columns. Now we can auto fit the columns automatically to the values contained within each cell by selecting all of the columns. I'm just going to do that by hovering my mouse above column A until I get that little black arrow pointing downwards. Click and drag across all of the columns that you want to widen. And then all we need to do is take our mouse and we can hover over any of these column boundary lines. And you'll see when you hover over, you get that double-headed arrow. Hover over any of them, double-click your mouse, and it's going to widen out those columns to the widest item in the column. So now you can see that everything auto-fits nicely into each column. Now that we've done that and our data is a little bit easier to read, we can now go in and remove these blank rows. Now my dataset is a fairly large dataset, so what I don't want to be doing is going through and removing them all manually. You might think the best way to do this is just to select the row, right-click your mouse and select delete. Now you could do that, it is going to remove the blank row, but that's a fairly tedious process, particularly if you have a data set as large as mine. So we want to find a way to do this quickly. Fortunately, Excel has us covered on this. We can either select all of the columns by using that same technique that we used previously, or if you don't want to remove, say, this blank row just here that separates the title from the data, you could choose to select just the entire data range. And we can do that by clicking anywhere in the data and pressing the Ctrl-A shortcut key to select all. Once we have everything selected, we want to go up to the Home tab and all the way across to the Editing group and click the drop-down underneath Find and Select. And for this, we're going to use Go to Special. And what Go to Special is going to allow us to do is basically find all of the blanks in the selected cell range. So if we go through our options, you can see one of them there is blanks. So let's make sure we select that and click on OK. Now, if you have a fairly large data set like I do, that might take a couple of seconds, but take a look at what's happened. It has selected all of those blank rows. Now that I have them selected, I can simply go back up to the Home ribbon, into the Cells group, click the drop down underneath Delete and say Delete Sheet Rows. And like magic, in a couple of clicks, we've managed to remove all of those extraneous blank rows. Just to show you how that affects that pivot table, let's jump back to sheet 1. And what I'm going to do here is quickly refresh this pivot table, and you should see that where we have blank at the bottom, that's going to disappear. So I'm going to click refresh and refresh all, and blank has now disappeared. So that is how you can quickly delete all blank rows in your data source. So now that we've removed all of the blank rows from our data set, the next thing we want to check for is duplicates. And if we find a duplicate, we want to remove it. Now when it comes to duplicates, the way you do this really depends on the type of duplicate that you're looking for. For example, you can see if we take a look in the sales channel, so column D, you can see that we have the words online and offline repeated. So technically, these could be classed as duplicates. Now, do I want to remove this type of duplicate? No, I do not. In this case, I only want to remove a record if every single column is an exact duplicate of another column. And again, this is something that can sometimes happen, particularly if you're importing your data. Sometimes your files can get corrupted, or maybe it just comes across with additional duplicated rows. So you want to make sure that you are checking for that, because again, this can cause problems when you go to create your pivot table. So the duplicates I'm checking for are exact duplicates, where every single piece of row information is technically duplicated. So we have two of the same record. Unfortunately, Excel has a remove duplicates utility that makes this extremely easy. So make sure that you're clicked somewhere within your data set up to the Data tab, and for this we want to go all the way across to the Data Tools group. And this is the icon that you're looking for just here, remove duplicates. And you can see in the screen tip what it says, delete duplicate rows from a sheet. You can pick which columns should be checked for duplicate information. So that last paragraph there is extremely important. So let's click the icon. And this is where we get a choice of all of the columns in our data set, and we can essentially define which ones we want to check for duplicates in. So if you were just interested in looking for duplicates in one particular column, you could deselect everything except the column or columns that you're interested in. Now I want to check every single column because I'm looking for duplicated rows effectively, where the data is exactly the same. I want to ensure that I have the My Data Has Headers checkbox checked and click on OK. And it's as simple as that. And take a look at the message that I'm getting. So I can see here that Excel has found 4 duplicate values and it's removed them. So all I need to do now is click on OK, and those duplicate rows have been removed. The next thing we're going to tidy up in this worksheet is all of this weird formatting that we have applied. So you can see that some of the cells in this worksheet have this kind of grey shading in the background. Some have this yellow highlighted shading. And I can also see that some of the numbers here have come across in bold. And also I have some italics a little bit further down. So all of this gives the entire worksheet a very inconsistent feel. And again, this is something that you'll find frequently happens, particularly if you import your data. Sometimes whatever formatting is applied in the system that you've imported the data from will apply in Excel. And a lot of the time, it's not going to be the type of formatting that you want. So having a quick way of being able to remove all of this formatting and just take your data back down to plain text and values is really important. Once you have that clean slate, you can then go in and apply the appropriate formatting if you want to. So let's get rid of this shading in the background and the bold and italic formatting. Once again, we just need to click in our data set and press the Ctrl-A keyboard shortcut to highlight all of our data. Let's jump up to that Home tab, and this time we're going all the way across to the Editing group. And notice in here we have a button called Clear. And you can see it says, when we hover over, the screen tip says delete everything in the cell or remove just the formatting, contents, comments or hyperlinks. And when I click this drop down, I have a number of different options. So you can choose which one is most appropriate for your data set, but let's just run through each one so you know what they do. The first button here, Clear All, that is literally going to delete everything out of your worksheet. I don't want that, so let's Control Z to undo it. Let's click it again. The next one is Clear Formats, and this is going to clear only the formatting that is applied to the selected cells. So this is going to be the one that we want to use. It's going to remove that background shading, remove any bold, italics, and just take it back to plain text. It is worth noting that if you have number formatting applied to certain columns, so for example, the unit price column or the unit cost column, if I had currency format applied to that, which I don't currently at the moment, just be aware that when you clear formats, it's going to remove any number formatting you've applied as well. So you might have to jump in and reapply it. Now, this is why I like to do this step before applying number formatting to my columns. So I'm not kind of doubling up on the work that I'm doing. So let's leave this option for a moment because that is the one that we're going to use because I want to show you what these other ones do. Now, clear contents, this is going to clear the contents in the selected cell, but it's not going to clear the formatting or any comments. So if I click clear contents, you can see what that leaves us with. It's deleted all of the values and the text, but it has still left the formatting. And that can be really useful in certain situations. Let's Control Z to go back. The next one clears comments and notes. Now, I don't have any comments or notes in this data, but if I did, I could choose to clear them all in one go. And then finally, we have clear hyperlinks. So again, this is a great one if you've imported maybe some employee information where you have a list of employees and then you have a list of all their email addresses. If those email addresses have imported as hyperlinks and you just want to remove all of the hyperlinks, you can choose clear hyperlinks and it will leave the email address, but it just won't be a link any longer. And again, that can be really useful in certain situations. So that is what all of those different clear options do. Let's now select the one that we want, which is clear formats. And immediately you can see the effect that that has had. Our data looks a lot more consistent. So very quickly, we've managed to remove all of that background shading, bold, italics, any formatting that you have applied, you can remove by using that clear formats button. A great quick way to tidy up your data. Now that we've gone in and cleared all of that unwanted formatting, it's time for us to go into our data and start to apply the formatting that we want. And again, this is a really important step because it's going to make your data a lot easier to read. Now, the name number formatting is a little bit misleading because it's not just columns that contain numbers that you can format. You can basically format any column. So if we start with column A, let's take a look at what we have in column A. Well, what I have in here is text. It's not numbers, it's not percentages, it's not currencies, it is simply text. Now, if I go up to the Home tab and into the number group, this is where you'll find all of your number formatting options. And you can see here we have a drop down and that opens up all of the different number formats that we can apply. So we have the 10 most common ones. If you want to take a look at some of the other types of number formatting that you have available, you can click more number formats at the bottom, which is going to open up the Format Cells dialog box. Now, just as a note, there is a keyboard shortcut to quickly jump you into this screen, and that is Control 1. That's going to take you to that Format Cells window. And which one of these you apply to each column is really determined by the type of information that you have in that column. So for example, in column A, I have text. So I'm probably going to want to use the text formatting. So before we do that, let's make sure that we have actually selected column A. And I'm going to make this a little bit of a quicker process because I can see that columns B, C, D, and E are also text. So I'm going to select all of these columns. I'm going to press Control 1 and let's choose text and click on OK. So now when I'm clicked in any of these columns, if we take a look in the number group, you can see it's telling me that we have text formatting applied. Let's take a look at some of these other columns. Now, column F, this is a little bit of a strange one because we technically have two pieces of information combined into one cell. Now what we're going to do in a later lesson is I'm going to show you how you can split up this information so that you just have order date in one column and ID in the next. So for the time being, I'm going to leave this column because we're going to format it later on once we've split it up. Let's move on to ship date. Now I can see here that this is supposed to be displaying as a date. But instead of a date, I have this weird number. And again, this is something you'll see fairly frequently in Excel. You might expect a date to be in the cell, but instead you're getting a number. So what exactly is this number? Well, this is what you'll see when you don't have date format applied to a column that contains dates. And if you take a look up at the number group, you can see currently I have general formatting applied, and general formatting is kind of the default. It has no specific format. So Excel doesn't know that I want these numbers formatted as a date. So where are these numbers coming from? In the context of Excel, all dates are numbers. And the beginning of time, again, according to Excel, was the 1st of January 1900. So that would be day number 1. And then each day from that point has been assigned a number. So if I was to go to, let's just click in a random cell over here, if I was to type in January the 2nd, 1900 and hit enter, if I apply general formatting to that, it gives me 2 because it's the second day according to Excel, the 2nd of January 1900. So all of these numbers in here represent dates. But if you don't have date formatting applied, it's going to display the actual numeric value, the number, as opposed to the date. So let's deal with that straight away. I'm going to select the entire column, and this time we're going to go up to our menu, and we have a choice here of short date or long date. And short date effectively looks like that, and long date looks like that. So it really depends how you want your dates to look. Now, it is also worth noting that if you want to get quite specific about how your dates look, you can go into more number formats and choose to create a custom format for your cells. Now, custom formatting is more of an advanced topic, so I'm not going to cover it, but I wanted to mention it in case it is something that you need to do, and I would encourage you to do a little bit further reading on how to create your own custom date formats. For our example, we're just going to keep it on short date. You can see that that column is a bit too wide, so I'm going to double click to auto fit it so that it looks a little bit neater. Let's move on to the next columns. So now we have the number of units sold. So this is really just a number, so I can highlight the column. I'm going to go up to the drop down and I'm going to set this to number formatting. Now you can see by default it's given me 2 decimal places. Now in this case I don't actually want that. This is just the number of units sold. So really everything after that decimal place is kind of irrelevant. There are a couple of different ways that you can remove decimals from cells, and that is by using the increase decimal or the decrease decimal buttons in the number group. Alternatively, again, if you press Ctrl 1 to jump into format cells, you can see here we can take those decimal places down to 0 and click on OK. And now we're just left with the whole number. Now the remaining columns in this spreadsheet, unit price, unit cost, total revenue, total cost, and total profit, these all need to be displayed with a currency symbol. And for this example, I'm going to be working in US dollars. So I'm going to select all of these columns. I'm going to press Ctrl 1 to go into format cells. And for this, I'm really going to choose between either currency formatting or accounting formatting. Both of these formats allow me to add a currency symbol and effectively change these into monetary values. Now, when it comes to which one you choose, currency or accounting, there is a very important difference. So the accounting format is basically been created for the accounting industry. What it's going to do is it's going to add a currency symbol of your choice, and you can go through the list and select the one that's appropriate for your data. We can choose how many decimal places we want. I'm going to leave mine at 2. But as you can see underneath, accounting formatting lines up the currency symbols and decimal points in a column. And the reason why this is called accounting formatting is because in the accounting industry, where they have to read down long lists of numbers, having the currency symbol lined up and the decimal point lined up in a column really adds to the readability of the data in the column. Whereas currency format will do a similar thing. I can select how many decimal places, I can select my currency symbol, but it doesn't align decimal points in a column. And you'll also find that the currency symbol is kind of pushed up right next to the values. So let me show you the difference. Let's apply currency. That is what that looks like. Now my values are all fairly uniform in here, so for the most part my decimal points are lined up, but take a look at the currency symbol, it's right next to that value. Let's take a look at what happens if we change it to accounting format. So Control 1, accounting, I'm going to leave it at 2 decimal places and click on OK. And we get a slight difference here. So we have all of our currency symbols are aligned to the left-hand side of the cell. They're all lined up, and so are those decimal places. So many times this is a lot easier to read, and I would say that I use accounting format a lot more than I use currency format. But the choice is up to you. Effectively, they both do a similar thing. So there we go. We have now applied the correct formatting to each column in our data, and we're ready to move on to the next stage. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is how to tidy up text by using text functions. And again, this is something that you might find yourself doing reasonably frequently. Now, if I take a look at my data set, I can see most of this looks fairly decent. Everything's starting to look quite consistent, but I can see that I have a few problems going on in column B. So if we take a look at these countries, can you see we have a lot of inconsistencies in the way this column looks? For example, I have some of the countries in uppercase, some of them in lowercase, and some of them in what we call proper case, where the first letter of each word is capitalized. I also have some weird spacing issues going on. So some of these have quite a bit of blank space at the beginning. Some of them have blank spaces in the middle. And what I ideally want to do here is have everything looking nice and consistent. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can basically use some very simple formulas in Excel to change the case of values in your cells. Now, I'm just going to be working on one particular column because everything else appears to be okay. But if you have multiple columns that you need to do this for, then just repeat this process for the additional columns. Now, there's a number of different ways that you can do this. The way that I like to do it is I like to insert what I call a helper column. And I'm going to insert it next to the column I essentially want to change the case of. So let's go up and select column C, right click and say insert. And that's going to insert me a little helper column. And I'll just name it helper so we don't get confused. And this is basically where I'm going to construct my formula, and then we'll copy and paste over the top once we're done. Now, if you've never used Excel formulas before, I would say don't be intimidated, don't be scared. The ones we're going to use in this lesson are extremely simple. Now, for those of you who have never used an Excel formula, there are over 500 different formulas contained within Excel. And you will find all of your formulas on the Formulas tab. And they're all in here in the Function Library group, categorized into different groups. So it really depends what type of formula that you're looking for. Now, the formulas that we're going to be using here is to change the case. So these are considered text formulas. And you can see all of the different formulas that we have to choose from. And I'm going to demonstrate 3 of these to you. Now, when you're ready to construct a formula, the first thing you need to do is type equals into the cells. So that lets Excel know that you want to construct a formula. Now, what if I wanted to change the case of all of the text in column B to uppercase? Well, I can use a function called upper. Now, in Excel, you type your function and then you need to open a bracket or a parentheses. And what you'll see underneath with the screen tip is it's going to show you what we call the function arguments. And this is just some helper information so you know what Excel requires in order for this formula to work. So I can see here that for this upper formula, it's telling me that I need to provide the text that I want to change to uppercase. So all I need to do here is select the cell that contains the text, in this case B4, and close off my bracket. You must always close off as many brackets as you open. And that is basically it. Now, if I hit enter, look what happens. It doesn't apply the formula, it's just showing me the text equals upper B4. Now, why is that? Well, if we go back to the Home tab, take a look in the number group, I can see that basically when I've inserted this column, it's taken on the number formatting of the columns that surround it. So it thinks that this is text in this column. And so it's showing me the text that I've typed. Now that isn't correct, so I want to select the column, and I'm just going to put this back to general formatting. Let's delete that out and try the formula again. So we're going to type in equals upper, open bracket. Let's select our cell B4, hit enter, and now that's looking a lot better. So I've managed to change very quickly cell B4 to uppercase. Now in this scenario, cell B4 was already in uppercase. But what I can do now is copy this formula down the entire rest of this data, and it will change all of the countries to uppercase. Now, how can we do that quickly? Well, we can use our autofill handle. So if you take a look at the cell that we currently have highlighted, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have a very tiny green square. And if I hover my mouse over that green square, you can see that my cursor changes to a small black cross. All I need to do to copy this formula down is double click, and you can see it's going to change everything to uppercase. Now it's not going to do anything about this weird spacing. We're going to deal with that in the next lesson. But if you want to quickly change the case, that is what you would do. Now I'm going to Control Z out of that because I don't actually want these to show in uppercase. Let's double click in the cell and go in and edit our formula. What if I want to change everything to lowercase? We can probably imagine what's coming here. All I need to do is change this from upper to lower. We have the same argument, which is text, so let's just hit enter. And once again, I can double click to fill that down and everything is changed to lowercase. Now again, this isn't what I want, so let's Control Z. What I actually want here is to convert everything into what we call proper case, where the first letter of every word is capitalized. So as you can imagine, we can just edit this formula and use the proper function. Now this time I'm going to edit the formula up in the formula bar just above because it is a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to delete out where we have lower and I'm going to change it to proper. The argument is exactly the same, we just need to provide the piece of text. Let's hit enter, and then once again I can double click to copy that down the rest of my rows. So now this is looking a lot more consistent with regards to the case of this text. And I would advise that you do this on any columns that you see that have inconsistencies. So now that we've changed the case, we effectively have two columns displaying the same information. One of them is what we call the dirty data, and one of them is the clean data. So you might think that what you can do here is simply go in and delete out column B. But take a look what happens if I right click and try and delete this column. I'm going to get a whole bunch of reference errors in these cells. Now why is that? Well, let's Control Z to go back and let's check out our formula. I'm going to double click. You can see that our formulas refer to text in column B. So if I delete column B, Excel has nothing to refer to. So how are we going to get around this problem? We want to keep basically what we see here, but we don't want to have this formula underneath. Well, this is where we can use paste special in Excel to just paste the values over the top, and it's going to throw away those underlying formulas. So what I'm going to do here is I'm basically going to cut everything I have in column C, and then I'm going to use paste special and paste only the values over the top in column B. Now for this, I don't want to select the whole column because if I cut this column and then paste it over here, because I have a cell at the top that has blue shading in, it's basically going to apply blue shading in column B as well, which I don't want. So I just literally want all of this text. I don't need the heading row, so I'm going to click on cell C4 and I'm going to use a shortcut key which is going to allow me to select everything from this point down. And that shortcut key is Control Shift down arrow. So now I'm going to press Control C to copy. I'm going to jump all the way back up to the top of my data, Control up arrow, and I'm going to select cell B4 because this is where I want to paste it. So let's go to the Home tab, click the lower half of the Paste button, and you'll see that we have something here called Paste Values. And that essentially will just paste what you see, and it will throw away any underlying formulas. So let's click Paste Values. It's pasted those across, and I can now delete out column C, and I'm not getting any errors. So changing the case using formulas and also using that paste special values trick is going to be invaluable to you when you're trying to tidy up data in Excel. So now that we've changed the case and we have a certain level of consistency in column B, it's time to deal with these erroneous spaces that we also have in this column. If you take a look at, for example, this first one just here where we have Chad, you can see that we have a number of blank spaces just before the word. We have blank spaces in between Czech and Republic. We have some blank spaces before Haiti, Algeria, things like that. And again, if these aren't removed from your data, it's going to mean that any pivot table that you create is going to be less accurate and be harder for people to read. So it's always a good idea to take a look at your data and remove any weird spaces. And I would say that even when I'm dealing with a data set where everything looks consistent, so for example, if all of my data set looked like the data in column A, where I can't really see any weird spaces, I would still apply this next technique that I'm going to show you to the column. And the reason why is that sometimes, again, particularly when you're importing data from another system, there is erroneous spaces in your data. You just can't see them. So you might have 3 blank spaces right at the end like that. To the naked eye, it looks like there's no weird spacing, but if you actually double click in the cell, you can see your cursor is all the way over here. So technically you do have spaces at the end. So we want to have a way of quickly being able to ensure that we don't have any of these issues. And again, for this, we're going to use another Excel text formula called trim. So for this, I'm going to add in another helper column. And once again, if we just take a look at the formatting we have applied, again, it's called text. So I'm very quickly going to change that to general formatting so that we don't get any issues. Let's call this helper as well. And trim is, as you would expect, you just type in equals trim. Notice underneath, as I type that in, Excel is trying to help me by showing me all of the functions that match what I've typed. And this is called IntelliSense in Excel. And it's really helpful if you're looking for a specific function, but you're not exactly sure what it's called. And the beauty of this is if I start to type a function, so TRI, it comes up underneath with trim. I can see that it's highlighted in blue, so to select it, all I need to do is press the Tab key. It will complete the function name and add in that first parentheses for me. And this function is very similar to the proper, upper and lower in that it only has one argument that we need to provide the formula with, and that is the text that we want to trim. So again, we're going to trim B4 and close the bracket. Now I could hit enter here. And this is another little trick that I would encourage you to get in the habit of doing. Whenever you hit enter, your cursor is going to move down to the next cell. Now in this case, I want to use the autofill handle in the cell above. So it means I kind of have to click back up here in order to access that autofill handle. Now a much better way of doing this is if you finish typing in your formula and you want to remain in the same cell, press Control Enter instead, and it's going to keep you in that cell. Now I can use my autofill handle, double click to copy that formula down, and you can see that it's removed all of that weird spacing from these cells. Now, in addition to running this trim to remove erroneous spaces, there is another Excel function you can use which will remove non-printing characters. And you'll notice them because they appear as kind of tiny little square boxes randomly in your cells. That is what we class as non-printing characters. It might be that the data set that you've imported had some kind of formatting or maybe some kind of character which Excel can't display. So instead you get these little square boxes everywhere. If you do find that you have something like that, there is another Excel formula that you can use which will remove them. And that formula is called clean. And this leads me on quite nicely to talking about how you can combine multiple formulas in one cell. So instead of adding another helper column and running clean on column B, what I could do here is utilize the helper column that I already have. Let's double click on the first one and I could combine clean with trim and effectively run both formulas at the same time. Now you'll notice that I don't actually have any non-printing characters, but it doesn't matter too much as long as you get the idea. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to edit the formula, and actually let's do this up in the formula bar as it's a little bit easier to see. So what I can do here is type in clean, open a bracket, and you can see that the argument that we have for clean is text. So again, that's going to be cell B4. Now the text in this case is actually already being generated by that trim function. We have trim B4, so Excel knows which cell we're talking about. So all I need to do is go to the end of the function, and the only thing we need to add here is a closing bracket. Why do we need to add that? Well, we must always close off as many opening brackets or parentheses as we open. Now, the cool thing about Excel is that if you don't add the correct amount of brackets at the end, Excel now has a feature that will pop up and say, you haven't added enough brackets, would you like me to fix this for you? So if you just click OK, it will add in the relevant number of brackets. But I think we've got this right, so let's press Control Enter so that we remain within the same cell. And then of course we can use our autofill handle to copy that down. So very simple to combine formulas. Now, if you remember in the previous example where we were changing the case, we used the proper function as well. So instead of doing all of this separately, I could even add proper to this formula and basically change the case, remove non-printing characters, and remove those erroneous spaces all in one go. So let's see how that works. Let's just, for this example, change everything back to uppercase. I'm going to go up and edit the formula in the formula bar, and I'm going to use the upper formula. Let's open brackets. Again, our only argument is text. That's already being generated by these two functions. So all we need to do is add another bracket on the end, hit enter, and then I can use the autofill handle to copy down. And effectively, I've applied 3 different cleaning techniques in one formula. Pretty cool and a great way to save time. And it just means you're not having to create additional helper columns each time you want to do multiple things. Now I'm going to change this back to proper. Hit enter and copy down. Remember, if you have a column that uses formulas as we do in column C and you want to delete out the column that contains all of the mistakes, remember, because we're referring to column B in this formula, we can't just delete the column. So we need to do our paste special trick again. So I'm going to select Control Shift down arrow to select all of that data, Control C to copy, Control up arrow to jump back to the top. Let's click in column B, go to our paste button and paste just the values. And then now I can delete out column C and I have a perfectly cleaned and consistent looking column B. Something else that you can use the clean function for, not only for removing non-printing characters, but you can also use it to remove manual line breaks. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we take a look at column A, on first glance, everything looks fairly consistent. I've got the names of the different regions. But look what happens if I double click on row 9, where we have Sub-Saharan Africa. Take a look at that. The word Africa is actually on another line. So somebody has put in here a manual line break. And if I click somewhere else on the worksheet, you can actually see that as it is. We have Sub-Saharan, we then have a line break, and then we have Africa. And if I go through this column, I'm probably going to find that I have that reasonably consistently throughout this data. Now, I don't want a line break in there. I want to have just all of the regions listed out in one cell on one line. So this is something else I can use the clean function for. So very quickly, let's do that. Let's insert a helper cell. I'm going to change the formatting of this column. Let's put that back to general. And we're going to use the clean function. Let's select our text, A4, close the bracket. And now if I double click to copy down, you should find that Sub-Saharan Africa is now all on one line. So now that we have those line breaks removed, we want to get rid of column A. Now remember, because the formulas in column B refer to column A, we can't just go in and delete column A because we're going to get some reference errors. So we're going to use our little paste special trick once again. So let's select cell B4. I'm going to press Control Shift down arrow to select all of the data, Control C to copy, Control up arrow to jump to the top. And now we're going to paste those values directly over what we have in column A. So up to paste, down to paste values. And there we go. Now we can safely delete out column B and we have a perfectly formatted column A without any of those line breaks. So now our data is really getting there. But there's still a couple of things that we need to do prior to analysing it with a pivot table. Now in this lesson, I want to focus on column F. Now what you'll notice about column F is that we basically have two different types of data combined into one column. We have the order date, which currently is an unformatted date, which is why we're seeing that number. And then we have an order ID, which is just a simple number. Now, ideally, we want to have these two pieces of information in separate columns. We want one column for the order date and one column for the order ID. So this is going to require us to break up the data that we have in this column. So what we're going to do in this lesson is I'm going to show you some techniques you can use to split up data in cells and also do the reverse of that if you ever need to join data together. So before we get on to doing it on our data set, let's open up a different worksheet and I'll show you a few examples. So this worksheet that we're going to use here is available to download in the course files folder. And I'm going to show you three different examples, two examples of how to split data and one example of merging data. And then you can basically choose which one you want to use that's most appropriate for your data and the task that you're trying to accomplish. So let's start out with this first example at the top here, text to columns. Now, text to columns is really useful if you have lots of data combined into one column that you want to break up. And you'll find that if you ever import data from maybe a text file or some kind of notepad file, quite often it will come across in a format that looks something similar to this. So effectively what we have here is the employee name, then a comma, then their job title, then another comma, then their department. And this in its current format is pretty difficult to read. It would be much better if we could break it all up, have the name in the first column, the job title in the second, and the department in the third. So one way that we can break this data up is by using text to columns. So the first thing I'm going to need to do here is select all of the data that I want to split. We're then going to go up to that Data tab, and in the Data Tools group there, we have a big button called Text to Columns. And you can see as I hover over it, the screen tip tells us what this is going to do. It's going to split a single column of text into multiple columns. For example, you can separate a column of full names into separate first and last name columns. You can also choose how to split it up, fixed width, or split at each comma, period, or other character. So let's click Text to Columns. Now what this will do is it's going to open up the Convert Text to Columns wizard. So it kind of walks you through the process of breaking up your data. Now the first thing we need to choose here is the file type that best describes our data. Now you can see by default it's selected delimited. Now what does that actually mean? Well, it means how your fields are separated. So if I take a look at my data, I can see each field, the name, the job title, and the department are separated with commas. And basically what this will do is it will look for all of the commas and split the data wherever it finds one. So in this case, this is going to be the option that I want to use. So let's keep that selected and click on Next. We then need to tell the wizard what delimiter we're using. And we have a choice of all of these different types of delimiter. So if instead of a comma, we had our fields separated with a tab, I could choose that. Maybe a semicolon, a comma, which is what we actually have, a space, or we have an option for other. So if your data is using some other kind of delimiter, you can select other and specify the delimiter in this field. Now we're using a comma, so I'm going to deselect tab and choose comma. Now when I click this, take a look at the data preview underneath. You can see it's going to give me a quick preview of how my data is going to be split up. It's going to be split up wherever it finds a comma. And I can see that that looks absolutely perfect. Let's click on Next. Now there's a couple of things I can do in here. The first one is I can choose my column data format. So depending on what type of data I have in here, I can select the column, and we do that simply by just clicking on it until it's highlighted. And then I could choose text from here if I wanted to. Now I will say this step isn't entirely necessary. You can just keep it on general format. The most important thing here is the destination. So where do we want our new broken up text to appear? Well, I don't want it to appear in B8, which is what we currently have selected. So let's remove that because I want it to appear in this little table here. So I'm going to select D9, which is effectively where the first entry is going to be. I can now click on Finish. And Excel is telling me that there's already data here because it's recognizing that I have some column headings just above. Now that's absolutely fine in this case. I'm going to click on OK to replace it. And would you take a look at that? We have perfectly split up data. Nice and straightforward. Let's now take a look at another way that we can break up data. And this is really one of those little magic tricks in Excel. It's a feature that I love and use so often. So with the release of Excel, I think it was 2013, came a new little feature called Flash Fill. And this makes breaking up your data or even combining data together so much quicker and easier. And I would say most of the time, these days, I tend to use Flash Fill a lot more than I use text to columns. So how does Flash Fill work? Well, you can see underneath here, I have a list of names. Now, it might be that I have these combined into one column that just says name at the top. And what I want to do is I want to break up this into first name and last name. Now, I could use text to columns like we just did and specify the delimiter as a space, but a quicker way of doing it is to use Flash Fill. So if I click in cell C20, if I type in how I want the first one to look, I'm going to press Control Enter to leave me in the cell. And if we go to the Data tab in the Data Tools group, you'll see that we have a button just here called Flash Fill. And this does also have a keyboard shortcut of Control E to make it even quicker. Now check out what happens when I click on Flash Fill. It basically fills down the pattern. So it recognizes that in the cell, the pattern that I'm looking for is I just want the first name, and it basically copies that pattern down to the other cells. So easy and so quick. Now there is another way that we can do this. If we go to last name this time, I'm going to type in the first one, go to the cell underneath, and instead of clicking the Flash Fill button, if I start to type the second last name, you can see it kind of grays down the rest of those surnames. If it all looks good, I just need to hit enter and it's going to input those into the cell. So a super quick way of breaking up your data. Now we could also do this in the reverse. So if I now wanted to basically have the full name, let's just copy across this formatting to make everything nice and neat, I could do the reverse of this. So I'm going to say I want Deb Ashby in here. Control Enter, and this time I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut for Flash Fill, which is Control E. And you can see that that copies that pattern down. So Flash Fill can be used to break up your data or combine data together. A really useful little tool. Now the final technique I'm going to show you here is using an Excel function to combine data together. And this way is a little bit more flexible if you want to add additional things into your combined data. So effectively what I have here is I have my list of names and I have those people's job titles. And I want to combine these together in a cell so it shows their name and their job title. But what I want is to have these separated by a hyphen. So effectively, I want it to look something like this. So if we go for this first one, I want it to say Deb Ashby hyphen IT trainer. Now, the easiest way for me to do this is to use an Excel function called concat. Now, in slightly older versions of Excel, it was called concatenate. These days, you're going to find the concat function. So select whichever one is available in your version of Excel. So how does concat work? Well, let's click in cell E30. I'm going to type in equals because we are typing a formula. I'm going to start to type concat, and you can see there it's at the top of the list. Also notice that further down the list I have concatenate, but it has a little warning symbol on it. That is basically telling me that that is a function that I can still use in this version, but that it is an old version of the function. The one that we want is the top one. Because it's highlighted, I can press Tab to select and put in that bracket. Now, the arguments for this function is basically we just need to select the text that we want to join together. So my first argument is text 1. So my first piece of text is what we have in cell B30. Now, if I press comma, it's going to ask me for text 2. So if I now click C30 for the job title and close the bracket, if I hit enter, it's going to look like that. So there's no space and there's no dash. So I need to jump in, double click to edit the formula and add something else in here. So after the first piece of text, text 1, I want to add space dash space. And because this is effectively text that we're adding to a formula, text always needs to go within quote marks. So I'm going to add a quote mark, space dash space, close quote mark, comma. So effectively I have 3 pieces of text here. B30, which is my name, text 2 is that hyphen, and then text 3 is the job title. Let's hit enter, and that looks perfect. I can now use my autofill handle just to copy that down. So 3 different techniques there which are really good for merging and splitting data. So with all that said, let's jump back to our actual data set and use some of these on that column F. So here we need to split up order date and ID. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add 2 new columns. Now to do this, I can highlight 2 columns, right click and select insert, and it's going to give me 2 columns. Both of these have a general format, which is absolutely perfect. And I'm going to add title of order date to this one and order ID. So now effectively I could use text to columns to break up this data, or I could use flash fill. And because it's a little bit quicker, I'm actually going to use flash fill. So for the order date, currently we have this weird number. We're going to change that in a moment, but I'm going to type in the first one. So 40570. I'm going to press Control Enter. And then if we go to the data tab, I'm going to click the flash fill button and it's going to fill all of those order dates down. Like magic, it is so quick. Let's do the same thing for order ID. Now I'm going to make this a little bit quicker on myself just by simply double clicking, highlighting the text, Control C to copy. I'm going to escape out of there and just paste that in. And this time I'm going to use my shortcut key for flash fill, Control E. And that's going to copy all of those down as well. And because we're not using formulas in either of these columns, I can safely right-click and delete out column F. The final thing we need to do here is change the formatting on the order date. So currently it's displaying in, I believe that is general format. Yes, it is. Let's select the column, go to our drop down, and I'm going to change this to short date. And now we're looking absolutely perfect. In this very quick lesson, I just want to show you how to deal with numbers in your worksheet that have been stored as text. And again, this is something that can happen, particularly when you're importing your data. So let me just show you a quick example. I'm going to scroll across just to a blank column outside of our data. Now, if I have a column, such as column P, and it's formatted as text, which it is just here, if I then try to type a number into this cell, so let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and hit enter, you can see a couple of things here. Firstly, I have that little green triangle in the top corner, which denotes that there is an issue or some kind of problem with this cell. And also notice that the number is aligned to the left-hand side of the cell. And in general, anything that's aligned to the left is text, whereas numbers are always aligned to the right. So I can see that this has incorrect formatting. So if you import a data set and you find that you have columns where you've got numbers, they're all aligned to the left and they have these little green triangles, then you're probably going to want to deal with that and convert them back to numbers. So I'm just going to auto fill this down just to add a few more numbers in. You can see that they all have these weird green triangles. Now there are a couple of different ways that we can deal with columns that look like this. So if I select all of these numbers, notice at the top I have this little warning symbol. Now if I click it, it's going to give me an idea as to what this little error message or what this warning triangle is trying to tell me. And you can see at the top here, it's telling me the number is stored as text. So something super simple that I can do is simply highlight all of the numbers and go to Convert to Number. Immediately that error disappears and you can see that those numbers are now aligned to the right hand side of the cell. Now there is another way that I could deal with this, so let's Control Z to go back a stage. I could also use a formula to convert everything back to a number. And the formula here that we want to use is simply called value. Let's open the bracket, select the cell we want to convert, hit enter, and we get exactly the same result. So you can utilize either of these methods in your spreadsheet and make sure that all of your numbers are being stored in the correct format. So our data is now starting to look pretty good. But there are still a couple of final steps that I want to take prior to putting this into a pivot table. And in this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can utilize the find and replace utility. Now this might be something that you've used before in Excel. It's a fairly popular command. And what it allows you to do is basically find a specific text string or piece of data in your spreadsheet and replace it with something else. So this is great if you need to change a lot of pieces of information in one go. So the example we're going to use here is column B, where we have all of these country names. Now you'll notice that some of these country names, such as this one here, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, is quite a long name. Now you might want to keep this as it is, or you might want to convert it to a shorter version of its name. The reason why you might want to do that will become quite clear when we start creating things like charts. If we have the country listed on an axis, this is quite a lot of text to try and fit beneath the bar of the chart. So it could be beneficial for us going forward to make these names a little bit smaller. So instead of Democratic Republic of the Congo, I might want to replace every instance of that with DRC. The same thing for the United States of America. I might want to find that in my spreadsheet and replace it with USA. So let's do exactly that. Now, if you're just looking for data in one specific column, you can highlight the column before you choose to find and replace. If you're looking for something in the entire data set, you can just click anywhere in the data set and it will look through all of the columns. Now in this example, I'm just focusing on column B, so I'm going to select it. And what I can do here is either go up to the Home tab, go across to the Editing group and select Find and Select, and then Replace. Or a much quicker way of doing this is just to press Control F, keyboard shortcut, and then choose the Replace tab. Now one thing with this Find and Replace dialog box is that it holds in it the last find that you did. So you can see here I searched for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so I still have that listed in there. So I'm going to delete that out. All I need to do now is specify what I'm looking for and what I want to replace it with. So I'm going to start out with the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I want to replace this with DRC. Now let's just expand our options just here. Now notice that I was very careful when I typed in Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I was being quite careful to make sure that I match it to the case that I can see in the spreadsheet. Now I didn't really need to be that careful, because if we take a look at my options, you can see here I don't have match case selected. So if I typed in, let's say, the word of in lowercase, it would still find what I'm looking for because I'm not being very specific about matching the case. You can also see here that I'm searching within this sheet, I'm searching by rows, and I'm also looking for this text contained within formulas. So all I really need to click here is replace all. And you can see here it's made 60 replacements, and if I look at my worksheet in cell B7, you can see that the Democratic Republic of the Congo has now been replaced with DRC. I'm going to do exactly the same for United States of America. And I'm going to change that to USA. Replace all, 58 replacements. And let's do the final one. Now, just to show you how the case doesn't matter, I'm going to type United Kingdom all in capital letters. And I want to replace this with UK. And let's click on replace all. It's made 72 replacements, and click on close. So an extremely quick and useful way to find specific items and replace them with something else all in one go. Now again, it is worth noting, if you are a little bit of a formula lover, you can do the same thing using formulas. So let me show you this very quickly. I'm just going to insert a brand new column, and let's make sure that we format that as general. If I wanted to do exactly the same thing using a formula, I could use the substitute formula. So if I type in equals and start to type in substitute, you can see as soon as I type sub, it comes up underneath, so I can press my tab key. And here I can specify where the text is located, the old text, and then the new text. So my text is going to be located in cell B4, comma, to move on to the next argument. So let's kind of do the reverse of what we've just done. I want to change UK back to United Kingdom. So my old text is UK, comma, my new text is United Kingdom. Close the bracket, hit enter, and let's double click to copy this down. So now wherever we have UK, you can see that that's been replaced with United Kingdom. Now remember, column C now contains formulas that refer to column B. So if you want to utilize this substituted data, you're going to need to do the paste special, paste values trick again. Now I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to delete out column C because I'm actually perfectly happy having UK in this column. But that is how you can quickly find and replace data using the dialog box and also using the substitute formula. The final step I'm going to take to clean this data is something you should be doing on all of your worksheets, and that is running a spell check. Again, this is so important, particularly if you're going to analyze your data, because remember, if something is spelt wrong, the pivot table is going to see that as a completely separate item. So for example, if in sales channel, if I've accidentally spelt one of these wrong, so maybe I have an extra E on the end here, when I analyze this data, the pivot table is going to see this as being completely different to this. So we want to make sure that everything is spelt correctly. Now I'm sure you're probably used to spell checking your worksheets, but let's just very quickly run through it. You'll find your spell checker on the Review tab. And it's the first icon here in the proofing group, and you'll see that there is a keyboard shortcut for this of F7. So that's nice and easy to invoke whenever you need it. So let's press F7, and that's going to pull up the spell checker. Now, first thing to check is the language that you're using. Now, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm actually located in the United Kingdom. But because a lot of the work that I do is for American clients, I tend to have Excel set to English United States. And believe it or not, there is a lot of difference with the way that we spell words. We all speak English, but sometimes we like to add extra U's in words. So the first thing to check here is the dictionary language that you're using. So if you want to change this to something else, make sure you click that drop down and then select the correct language. So now you can see it's running through my spreadsheet. Now something to note here, the spell check will start wherever you're clicked in your worksheet. So if I was clicked halfway down my dataset, it's going to start from that point. It's not going to start from the top automatically. It will loop round once it gets to the end, but just be aware of that. So I can see here the first word it's found is cancelled, and I can see that I have too many L's in this particular word. Underneath, I have some suggestions, and I can see that we have the correct spelling just here, and I can choose to ignore all, I can change all, or I can add to the dictionary. Now, add to dictionary is a really important thing to note. Occasionally when you're spell checking, the spell check will come across a word that it doesn't necessarily recognize. And I find that this happens a lot if you have company names or people names or brand names, things like that. Those things aren't in the standard English dictionary. So Excel considers it to be a spelling error because it doesn't recognize the word. Now, if the word is spelt correctly and you don't want Excel to keep picking up this word as an error, you can choose to add it to your dictionary so it will ignore it next time. Now, in this case, I want to change this word cancelled. And I'm going to say change all, because if I have this word anywhere else in this spreadsheet, I want to change it to the correct spelling. So let's say change all. It's now moved on to the next spelling error that it's found. And if I have a look, I can see where we have baby food, yes, I have an additional T at the end there. It should just say baby. So I'm going to make sure I've got it selected in the suggestions and click change all. Now notice here, it's actually got to the end of my data because I wasn't clicked at the top. So it's asking me if I want to continue checking at the beginning of the sheet. So I'm going to say yes, so I don't miss out on anything. And a good job I did because I have another spelling error right at the start. I've spelt beverages wrong. I'm going to make sure I select it, change all, and now my spell check is complete. All I need to do is click OK, and what I'm left with is a completely error-free worksheet. Hi guys, and welcome back. In this section, I want to talk to you about the difference between Excel tables and pivot tables, because it's really important that you understand the distinction and the fact that they're not the same. And once we've established what the difference is between these two, it will highlight to you the importance of putting your data into an Excel table prior to putting it into a pivot table. And I know that sounds a little bit like you're doubling up on your tables, but there are many advantages to Excel tables, which are going to make your life a lot easier when you're working with pivot tables. So what I've done here is I've taken our clean data and I've just created a couple of extra tabs at the bottom. And the first tab here is called Excel Table. Now you'll notice that the data on this particular worksheet looks slightly different from our original sales data. And that is because I've put this data into an Excel table. And I'm going to show you exactly how to do that in the next lesson. Now, once you put your data into an Excel table, a couple of things happen. We get some formatting that's automatically applied. So I can see here I have some shading in that title row. I've got borders applied around each cell. And I've also got these little drop-down arrows at the top of each column. And what these are little filter and sort buttons. So if I want to sort the data in this particular column, I can. And I can also filter the data to maybe just see the data that I'm interested in. Now again, I don't want to go too much off down this tangent because we are going to cover this later on in the session. But just be aware, you automatically get these little drop downs when you put your data into an Excel table. Now, one of the coolest things about Excel tables is that they have auto expand capabilities. And what that means is if I jump down to the last row of my data, so I'm just going to press the Control down arrow, you can see I have just over 10,000 rows. If I was to add some more information into the bottom of this table, it's basically going to expand and that data will become part of this table. So if I just very quickly copy and paste something into here, notice the table has expanded. I've got that formatting applied to this row, and this new data is essentially part of the table. And what that means is that anything that I have that uses this table data, so maybe that might be a pivot table or some kind of chart, it means that any new data that I add will automatically be included in the pivot table data or in the pivot chart. I just need to click the refresh button to update my pivot tables to include that new data. Now, if I didn't have my data in an Excel table, it's not going to be automatically included in my pivot table when I create it. I would have to essentially go in and reselect the cell range to include the new data. So putting your data in a table makes you a lot more efficient and makes the process of adding new data and updating everything that hangs off of this data a lot simpler. So this is probably my number one recommendation prior to creating your pivot table. Another thing you'll notice is that as soon as you put your data into an Excel table, you get an additional ribbon at the top. And that ribbon is called Table Design. Now, Table Design is what we refer to as a contextual ribbon. It means it only appears as and when it's needed. So if I click somewhere outside of my table data, just in a blank cell off to the side, you can see the Table Design ribbon disappears. As soon as I click inside that table, it's available for me to use. And on this ribbon, I'll find everything I need to format this table, apply different options, and utilize different table tools. And we're going to look at some of these in the next lesson. So I highly recommend putting your data into a table prior to creating a pivot table. Now, just as a comparison, so you can see how different these are, this is an Excel table, and on the next worksheet, I have a very basic pivot table. And you can see that it looks completely different to an Excel table. The main difference between an Excel table and a pivot table is that Excel tables are essentially static. I can't do a great deal with this data. I can't analyze it in loads of different ways. I'm pretty much limited to either sorting it or filtering it. Whereas with a pivot table, I can move these fields around, I can add different fields in to view my data in all different ways. Now again, we're skipping ahead a little bit here, but I just really wanted to illustrate the difference between the two. Pivot tables are a lot more dynamic and are there to help you analyze your data, whereas Excel tables are a little bit more static. So now that we've established the difference and why Excel tables are going to be useful to you, let's move on to the next lesson and I'll show you how you put your data into an Excel table. So now that we have a clean data set and we know what the difference is between an Excel table and a pivot table, it's time for us to put this data into an Excel table. Now, what I've done here is I've saved this clean version of the file as Sales Analysis Clean. So if you want to pick up the course at this point and start out with a clean data set, then you can download this file from the Course Files folder. If you've simply been working on the Sales Analysis workbook and you've followed through every single step so far, you should be at this point as well. So how do we put this data into a table? Well, there are a couple of different ways that we can do this, as is always the way in Microsoft. There's always multiple different ways of doing the same thing. The first thing you need to make sure is that you are clicked somewhere within your data. It doesn't matter which cell, just anywhere, as long as it's within your data set. Now, if I want to put this into a table, the first method I could use is to go up to the Home tab, and then in the Styles group, I have a drop down here that says Format as Table. And you can see this shows me all of the different table styles. Now, the colors that you're seeing in here, these are determined by whatever theme you're using in Excel. And if we just go off and take a look at the theme that I'm using, we can find that on the Page Layout tab. In the first group just here, if I click Themes, I'm using the Office theme, which is the default for Excel. If I was using one of these other themes, so let's say Gallery, for example, you can see that changes the font that I'm using, but it's also going to change the colors of the table styles in this drop down as well. So if you're looking at this drop down menu and thinking to yourself, well, I have completely different colors, why is that? It's going to be because of the theme that you're using. So if you want to make sure that it's exactly the same as mine, change your theme to the Office theme. Now, with all that said, let's go back to our Format as Table drop down. notice that our table styles are divided down into different groups. We have custom at the top, light, medium, and dark at the bottom. And this is really personal preference. Whichever one of these you choose, it's going to apply that particular style to your data set. So if I was to choose something like this one just here, light grey table, style medium 8, I can say, yes, my table has headers, click on OK, and I get a very dark looking table style. Notice that as soon as I put my data into a table, I now get that table design ribbon. If I decide I don't particularly like this table design, I can simply go to the Table Styles drop-down and switch it for something else. And you'll see as I hover over, I'm getting a live preview as to what each one of these is going to look like. Now notice at the top, underneath Custom, I have a table style just here. And this is one that I've created for myself. It's a custom table style. And if you have a specific way that you want your table to look, you can create your own table style by clicking New Table Style at the bottom. Now, I'm not going to get into that now, and because you're not going to have access to the custom table style that I've created, I'm going to choose something that we can all use. So let's go for this one just here, Blue Table Style Medium 6, and click to apply. So that is the first way that you can apply a table style, by clicking the Format as Table drop-down and selecting one of the options. Now I'm going to Control Z just to go back a few steps to our plain data and show you an even quicker way of putting your data into an Excel table. Make sure you're clicked in the data and press the Control T keyboard shortcut. You get this little Create Table dialog box. Yes, my table has headers. Click on OK, and it's basically going to apply the default table style. And of course, if you don't like that formatting, you can choose another style from this drop-down. So let's reapply our Blue Table Style Medium 6. So those are the two methods you can use. Now, once you've converted your data and put it into a table, as I said, you're going to get this additional table design ribbon at the top. Now from here we have some table style options, and I can toggle these off and on and change the way that my table style looks. So if I deselect header, it's going to remove that header row. Now that's not particularly useful, so I'm going to put that back on. If I want to add a total row at the bottom, I could toggle that on, and it's going to jump me all the way down to the last row. It's going to add a total row, and I can see if I expand this column, because it's not quite wide enough, it's going to give me the total profit. Now, I'm not really interested in that at this stage, because we're going to be able to calculate this when we put it in a pivot table. So let's just turn off total row. Control up arrow to jump to the top. Now currently you can see that this table style includes banded rows, which means we have a blue row, then a white row, a blue row, then a white row, so on and so forth. If I want to turn that off, I just need to deselect banded rows and I get something that looks a lot cleaner. And I actually quite like it like this. I can choose to add a specific style to the first column only. And if I scroll across, you can see that it's going to make everything in that first column bold. Don't particularly like that. Let's turn it off. I could do the same for the last column. So it's going to apply some formatting, in this case, bold formatting, to the last column only. And if I want to, I can choose to have banded columns, which is going to give me basically something similar to banded rows, except down the columns. Now I'm going to turn that off because I don't particularly want that. And then the final thing we have here is the filter button. If you remember, I said automatically when you apply a table style, you're going to get these drop-down filters. And I find these really useful if I quickly want to run a sort on my data or maybe filter the items in this particular column. I can use this drop-down filter. But if you don't want them there, if you're not going to do anything like that, you can deselect filter button and it's going to remove them from those column headings. I'm going to keep mine because I do like to use those. Now the external table data group we're not going to use in this particular course, so I'm going to skip over that because it's not actually relevant to what we're doing. The next group, the tools group, this is where we can come to create a pivot table. We can remove duplicates from here. We've already done that, but we could do it from here. And we also have a convert to range button. So if you put your data into a table and then you decide that you basically want to take it out of the table and just have it as plain data, if you select convert to range, that's going to remove the table from your data. And then finally, we have the properties group. And all we really have in here is a couple of options, the first one being table name. Now, when you put your data into a table, Excel is automatically going to give that table a generic name. So you'll probably see something up here that says table 1, table 2, table 3, something like that. Now, you can keep those table names, but I would advise you to give your table a meaningful name, because that makes it a lot easier for you to identify this particular set of data. If you can imagine, if you have a workbook that has maybe 20 sheets and they all have Excel tables on them, if you want to quickly jump between your tables or maybe use your table data in a formula, when your tables are named just 1, 2, 3, 4, it's very difficult to know which one you're referencing. So I always like to give my table a meaningful name, so I'm going to call this sales underscore data. Now, it's worth noting here, when you're naming your tables, you can't have any spaces in the name. So you need to separate words with an underscore or make them all one word. Remember to hit the Enter key so that that table name sets. And then underneath that, we have a resize table option. Now, I don't need to do any resizing just here. I am happy with the way that it looks. So now that I have my data in an Excel table, I have it formatted as I like it, and I've given my table a meaningful name. Finally, we've finished preparing our data ready for analysis with a pivot table. And that's exactly what we're going to get onto in the next section. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the course. In this section, we're going to take a look at how we put together a pivot table. Yes, finally, after a whole section on cleaning data, we've made it to the part where we actually create a pivot table. And we're going to start out in this lesson by taking a look at something called recommended pivot tables. Now, if you notice, the worksheet that I'm working in currently is called recommended underscore pivot underscore tables.xlsx. And you'll find this file in the course files folder. And this file is basically just the clean version of our data. So if you haven't followed along all of the lessons in the previous section, you can simply open this one up and you're good to go for the next section. So now that we have our data in a table, let's take a look at recommended pivot tables. Now, you'll find these on the Insert tab. In the Tables group at the beginning, notice we have two different options. We have Pivot Table, and then we have Recommended Pivot Tables. So what exactly is this option? Well, if we take a look at the screen tip, it says, want us to recommend pivot tables that summarize your complex data. Click this button to get a customized set of pivot tables that we think will best suit your data. So that's exactly what it does. If we click this button, what we're going to get is this little pop-up window, and let's just widen that out a little bit, that is going to recommend the pivot tables that Excel has determined are best for our data. So it's basically taken a look at our data, and now it's suggesting different ways that we can organize that data using a pivot table. And in general, you'll find the one that's most appropriate for your data will be nearer the top of this list. And you can see that we have quite a few different recommendations. So the first one that I'm clicked on here, if I was to select this, it's basically going to create a pivot table for me, and it's going to arrange my data in the following way. So here I can see that it's going to list out all of the regions, and then it's going to give me the sum of the unit price. So if the analysis that I wanted to do was I wanted to see the unit price broken down by region, this would be a really nice quick way for me to create that pivot table. If we take a look at the second one down, this is summarized in a different way. So again, it's using the regions as my row labels, but this time it's doing a sum of the unit cost. The next one is different again. This time we have our row labels, and I can see that these are grouped. Now again, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but just know that when you have these little plus signs next to an item in your pivot table, it means that grouping is applied. And here, if I was to select this one, it's going to show me basically the total profit for each region, the total unit cost, and the total unit price. So if this is the type of information I'm interested in, again, that would be a great one to select. And I can carry on going through. So let's take a look at the next one because this is different again. This time it's showing me a summary in a slightly different way. So this time it's using the item type as the row labels, and then we have a sum of the revenue, a sum of the total cost, and then a sum of the total profit. And that's basically what each one of these are. It's showing me different ways that I could arrange this data and analyze it, and which one I choose is very much going to be determined by the type of information that I'm looking to get out of this pivot table. So with this one, for example, if I'm really interested in seeing the sum of the unit price for each of the item types, I would choose this one. And let's use this as our example. If I was to select this and click on OK, what Excel does is it gives me a new worksheet. So you can see it's just got the generic name of Sheet 2 currently, and it automatically creates that pivot table for me. So it means that I haven't had to build this table myself from scratch because effectively I've used a little template. And that is what recommended pivot tables are. Now, just because you use one of these, it doesn't mean that you have to keep it in this particular format. I could choose to change the fields that I'm summarizing or move fields around. And again, we're going to get onto that in the following lessons. For the time being, I'm going to delete out this worksheet. And I just very quickly want to go back into recommended pivot tables. Because something else that you have in here is you do have the option right at the bottom to create a blank pivot table. So if you want to start from scratch and define what fields you're using in your pivot table, you can just click blank pivot table at the bottom just here. Again, Excel is going to create a brand new worksheet, but it's going to show us a blank pivot table, which we can then build using our fields on the right-hand side. And this is pretty much exactly what we're going to do in the next lesson. I'm going to show you the different ways that you can create a blank pivot table, and then we're going to start adding in fields to analyze our data. So now that we've seen how to create a pivot table using recommended pivot tables, let's take a look at how we create one from scratch. Now there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. Now, one of the methods you can use is pretty much what we did in the last lesson. We can click in our data, in our table in this case, jump up to the Insert ribbon, and in that first group, we have an option for Pivot Table. Now, if we click this, it's going to take us to the Create Pivot Table dialog box. And there's a couple of things that we need to check in here before proceeding. So the first thing you'll see in here is it says choose the data that you want to analyze. And then we have a couple of different options. We have select a table or range or use an external data source. We also have a third option here, which is currently grayed out, so it's not available to me, of use this workbook's data model. Now notice the first option here has automatically been selected for me by Excel. And if you notice underneath, it says table range and then it says sales data. Now, because I was clicked in my Excel table data when I clicked on the pivot table button, Excel has assumed that the data that I want to use in my pivot table is basically everything that surrounds where I'm clicked. And because we named that table sales data, it's picked up the sales data table. So in this case, this is exactly what we want to use. However, before we move on, let's just explore this second option of use an external data source. Now, you would use this option if maybe you have data stored somewhere else, so outside of this particular workbook. So you might have that data stored in an Access table, or maybe you have it stored in just another Excel file. If that is the case, if you want to use that data in your pivot table, you can click on Choose Connection, browse for more at the bottom, and it's going to open up your local drives, and you can go in and select the file that you want to import. So that is what that second option is all about. Now we're going to use the first option because we want to use this table data. The next thing that we have to tell Excel is where we want this pivot table report to be placed. And again, we have three different options. We can choose to put our pivot table on a brand new worksheet. We can choose to add it to an existing worksheet. And if I was to select this option, underneath it says location, and this is going to allow me to basically select a specific worksheet in my workbook. Now, I only have one worksheet, and that is called sales data. But if I had another one listed down here, I could choose to place that data on that particular worksheet. I could even choose to put my pivot table on the sales data worksheet. Now, I wouldn't recommend that you do that. It's always good to get into the habit of separating out your data from your analysis. So always have your raw data set, your source data, on a different worksheet to your pivot tables and your pivot charts. So in general, the option that I tend to select here is New Worksheet. Now, once again, there is a third option where we can choose to add this data to the data model. Now, again, because this is a beginner's course, I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but this option here basically allows you to combine different data sets into one. So if I had 4 Excel tables containing data, I could add them all to the data model and then create pivot tables based off of that. But for the time being, we're going to stick with New Worksheet. Let's click on OK. Now notice at the bottom straight away, Excel has created me a brand new worksheet. It's called Sheet 5. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move this worksheet to the right hand side of my data source just for readability. So I just need to click and drag and drop to do that. What I'm also going to do is rename this worksheet. So let's right click, rename, and I'm going to call this, let's just call it Pivot Table for now, so that we don't get confused. We can always come back at a later stage and make that more meaningful once we know what our pivot table is going to contain. And what you're looking at on this worksheet is basically a blank pivot table report. You can see over here, we just have this sort of little rectangle that says Pivot Table 13. To build a report, choose fields from the pivot table field list. And over on the right hand side, you can see the pivot table field list. And I'm going to talk to you a bit more about exactly what this is in the next lesson. But that is kind of how you get started creating your pivot table. Now, what I want to do here is just show you another method that you can use. So I'm going to right click and let's just delete out this worksheet and go back to our data source. Now, instead of going to the Insert ribbon, you can also create a pivot table from the Table Design ribbon. And you'll notice here in the Tools group, we have Summarize with Pivot Table. And this is basically going to take you to exactly the same Create Pivot Table dialog box. So once again, I want to use this sales data table range and I want to place it on a new worksheet. So all I need to do is click on OK, and I have exactly the same thing. I can move my worksheet, right click, and rename this Pivot Table and hit Enter. So very straightforward and simple to start creating your pivot table from your Excel table data. So now that we have the bare bones of our pivot table, let's start to take an in-depth look at what exactly we're looking at on this worksheet. Now, as I mentioned, currently, when you create a pivot table from scratch, you're going to end up with a worksheet that contains a blank pivot table report. And I can see that over here on the left-hand side. Currently, it's not really displaying anything of use, but that's going to change in a moment. Now, the first thing I want you to note is that when you are clicked inside this pivot table report, notice that you have 2 additional ribbons appear. And again, these are contextual ribbons that you'll only see when you're clicked inside the pivot table. And I can see them now. We have Pivot Table Analyze and also Pivot Table Design. And these 2 tabs contain all of the commands that you're going to need to manage, organize, and change the look and feel of your pivot table. If I click my mouse outside of that pivot table report, just somewhere else on this blank worksheet, you can see that both of those ribbons disappear. They don't appear again until I'm clicked inside the pivot table, so until they're needed. So just bear that in mind because we're going to be dipping into these ribbons constantly when we're working with pivot tables. Now, if we briefly look at the Design ribbon first of all and get ourselves familiar with the types of things that we can do. Now, if we start with the group on the end called Pivot Table Styles, this is very similar to your table styles. So if you want to make your pivot table look a little bit nicer, you can choose a style from this drop down. Remember, these are all very much controlled by the theme that you're using in Excel. And we can also create our own pivot table styles if we want to. So again, very similar to Excel tables. If we move along, we have some pivot table style options. So again, this really relates to how we want this style to look. So do we want row headers, column headers, banded columns, banded rows? And then finally, the first group we have here is the layout group. And this allows us to control if we display subtotals and grand totals in our pivot table report. And we can also choose a report layout. So quite a few different options in there, which we'll go through when we add some data into our pivot table. We can also specify if we want to insert a blank line after each item or remove a blank line after each item. So all of these relate to the overall look and feel of your pivot table. Now, if we move across to the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, this is where you'll find your more functional options. So let's start right at the beginning of the ribbon this time, Pivot Table Name. Now, as is with Excel tables, by default, when you create a pivot table, Excel is going to give it a very generic name. So you can see here, it just says Pivot Table 15. And once again, a good habit to get into is renaming or giving your pivot tables a meaningful name so that you know exactly which pivot tables you're referring to in your worksheet. Now I'm going to come back to this and give it a more meaningful name when I've determined what data I'm going to display in my pivot table. I have some advanced options underneath, which we'll get into a bit later on. And other things that I can do on this ribbon, I can apply grouping. I can do things like insert slices and timelines, which are basically visual filters. I can refresh my pivot table and update it with new data. I can select different parts of my pivot table. I can move the pivot table, and I can even do things like create pivot charts from my pivot table data. And right on the end, we have a show group, and you can see that all of the buttons in here are toggle buttons. I can toggle these off and on depending on if I want to see them or not. And one of these that I'm going to use right now is this field list. Now what you'll notice is that if you click outside of your pivot table report, that pivot table field list on the right hand side completely disappears. Now, theoretically, when you click back in your pivot table report, that list should reappear. But occasionally it doesn't, and I can't tell you how many calls I used to get about this when I worked on a help desk. Now, if that pivot table fields pane doesn't reappear when you're clicked in the pivot table, all you need to do is go to your Pivot Table Analyze ribbon and make sure you have field lists turned on. The majority of the time, it's because this button here has become toggled off, so when you click in the report, you don't see that pane. So it's just a simple case of clicking that button to bring it back. So that was a very brief overview of the options that we have on these ribbons. A lot of these will become clearer as we go through the course. I want to end this lesson by talking about the main part of pivot tables, and that is the pivot table fields. So what do we have over here in this pane on the right? Well, if we take a look at all of these different fields, you'll notice that these are actually the column headings from our source data. So when we created a pivot table based off of that data, it imported all of the column headings. And then underneath there, we have these 4 currently blank areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. And what these basically do is determine the layout of our pivot table. It really controls the type of analysis that we're doing on our data. And the idea here is that you can grab any of these fields above and drag and drop them into any one of these 4 blank areas, and you'll start to build yourself a pivot table report. And which fields you choose to drop in which areas down here really determines the layout of your report and the type of analysis that you're doing. So I find if I'm going into a pivot table and I have an idea of what I want to analyze, that's always quite helpful. So if I know I want to find out how many units we've sold in each region, that's really going to help me when it comes to building my pivot table, because I know that I'm going to need the region field and also the units sold field. So I can drag and drop these 2 fields into any one of these 4 areas and take a look at how that's going to analyze my data. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next lesson. We're going to start adding in some fields, moving them around so you can kind of get an idea as to how pivot tables work. So now that we have a basic idea of the types of commands that we can find on the pivot table contextual ribbons, and we've also had a brief introduction to these pivot table fields, let's start building up our pivot table and adding in some data. Now, as I mentioned, it's always a good idea to have a little bit of an idea as to the type of analysis that you're looking to do. And if I take a look through my different fields here, let's start out by doing something reasonably basic. So maybe I want to find out the total profit by region. So what I can do here is I can grab the region field and I can drag it down into one of these 4 areas. Now, when it comes to where you place these fields, that's really entirely up to you. And the beauty of pivot tables is that they're so easy to change or pivot that if you get it wrong the first time, it takes 2 seconds to change it. Now, in general, this values area down here, this is where you're going to put your values. So anything like unit price, unit cost, total revenue, total cost, total profit, all of those types of fields would go into this values area. So if we grab region, let's start out by dragging and dropping that down into this rows area. Now notice when I let go, take a look at my pivot table report. Now what we have are all of the regions listed in the rows. Notice that it says row labels at the top and then it has grand total at the bottom. Now still, this isn't really displaying a great deal of information. So let's go and grab another field and I want to see what the total profit is by region. I'm going to grab this field and drag and drop it down into that values area. Now notice when I do that, take a look at what this field label now says. It says sum of total profit. So the pivot table has essentially aggregated all of the totals to summarize them by region. So now I can see the total profit for Asia, the total profit for Australia and Oceania, so on and so forth. And then right at the bottom, I've got a grand total of all of these added together. Now, depending on what type of field you drop into this values area, most of the time it will try and do a sum. There are some cases where by default it will do a count, depending on the type of field that you've dropped in there. Now, what else can I do with these fields? Well, maybe I decide that I don't want to have the region showing in the rows, I want it in the columns instead. So I can grab the field and drag it to columns, and my report layout changes to display in a completely different way. Now for me, this isn't the most easy to read, but hopefully that illustrates how flexible pivot tables are. Let's grab region and just drag that back to rows because I think that is a lot neater. Now I'm not just stuck looking at my report in this way, I can make it a lot more complex. So if I scroll up, let's take a look. Maybe I also want to break it down by item type. So I'm going to grab the item type field and I'm also going to drag that into the rows area and I'm going to drop it underneath region. Take a look at how that changes my pivot table. Now it's summarizing by region and then by item type. And it's going to go through each region and item type until we get all the way to the bottom where we have our grand total. And notice that next to the regions, we now have this little minus. So these turn into collapsible and expandable buttons. So if I'm just interested in one particular region, I could collapse everything up and just zero in on that. Now it's worth noting that if we do have these little collapsible and expandable buttons, if we go to the pivot table analyze ribbon, notice in that show group at the end, we can choose if we want to display those or not. So I can toggle this button off and on and choose if I want to display these buttons. Also, if I have an item that's collapsed up, if I right click my mouse in that cell and go to expand collapse, I have some further options in here. So I can choose expand to expand back out that item. So that's really all a pivot table is. You choose your fields, you drag and drop them to any of these areas until you get the analysis and the layout that you're looking for. Now, one little area down here that we haven't really spoken about is this filters area. Now, what this allows you to do is you can drag and drop a field into this area and it's going to allow you to apply some filters to your pivot table. So I'm going to grab the sales channel and I'm going to drag and drop that into filters and check out what I now have at the top. It says sales channel. I have a drop down and I can choose if I want to view the sum of total profit for these different regions and items just related to offline sales. Let's click on OK, and it's going to update that pivot table data. I can click again and choose online. And if you want to select multiple items, you have a little checkbox just here, which will allow you to go through and select all of the items that you want to see. So this is very similar to any other filter that you would have used in Excel and can be super useful when you're trying to hone in on specific details. When you hear people talk about multiple dimensions in the context of pivot tables, all that really means is adding in more fields to analyze your data in different ways. So if we remove some of these fields, and this is a good opportunity to show you how to delete fields from these different areas. So I'm going to grab sales channel, and all you need to do to remove it is just drag and drop it outside of that pivot table fields area. Notice I have a red cross. When I let go, it removes the field. Let's remove item type as well to take us back down to just the region and the sum of total profit. So this would be a one-dimensional pivot table. We just have our regions and the sum of total profit. As soon as we start adding in other fields, it then becomes a pivot table that has multiple dimensions. So as we've already seen, we can add item type, and we could go a stage further and start adding some other dimensions into the columns. So for example, maybe instead of having it in the filters area, I want to display the sales channel in the columns. So let's drag and drop it and see what we get. So now take a look running across the top. I can see my data summarized by region, by item type, but also by offline and online sales. And then we have our grand total at the side and also a grand total running across the bottom. I can even grab something else. So let's go for order priority, and I'm going to drag and drop that underneath the sales channel in the columns area. And this is where we start to get really complex. So now we're analyzing by essentially 4 different dimensions. We have our region, our item type, we then have offline and the order priority, and then online and the order priority. So very quickly, I can see the sum of the total profit for the Asia region for office supplies that were purchased offline but had high priority. This would be my answer just here. So simply by adding in fields, we create ourselves a multi-dimensional pivot table that can go really deep when it comes to analysis. I could then go a stage further and maybe add something like the order date into the filters area. So let's drag and drop that down. And now at the top here, I can go through and I can start filtering this by specific months. So let's select February, March and April, click on OK, and all of the data is going to update. So that is a multi-dimensional pivot table. In this lesson, I'm going to talk to you about deleting fields and locking the report layout. Now, I already showed you how to delete fields in the last lesson. So let's go ahead and do that because currently this is a little bit of a chaotic pivot table report. Let's make this a little bit easier to read. So I think I'm going to delete the order priority field from columns. So again, I'm just going to drag it outside of that pivot table fields area, let go, and it's going to remove it. So now that looks a little bit easier to read and it's a little bit easier to manage. Now, one thing that you'll notice when you start working with pivot tables is that quite often, depending on the type of data that you have within your cells and also the fields that you choose to use in your pivot table, quite often the layout of your report will kind of jump all over the place. And that is mainly because the default in Excel pivot tables is that they will always auto-expand to accommodate the contents of the cell. Now, most of the time, that is exactly what you want it to do. So if this number grows a bit larger, or maybe I had a much smaller number in there, I don't want to have a very wide column if I have a very small number in there, or a very small column if I have a very wide number. So autofit will autofit to the widest contents, and that is the default. Now, sometimes you have situations, and I would say this tends to come up when people start creating pivot charts next to their pivot tables. Because what generally tends to happen is if you have a pivot chart just here, right next to your pivot table, and you start moving the fields around, because the report layout is going to change, sometimes you find that your pivot table is going to start overlapping your chart, and you find that you're constantly moving things around. So if you want to have a little bit more control over the width of the columns, you can turn off that auto fit. So let me show you very quickly where you go to do that. Make sure that you're clicked inside your pivot table, and then up on the pivot table analyze ribbon, we're going to go to the first group here called pivot table. And for this, we need to jump into options. Now there's lots of different options that you can get your teeth into in here. The tab that we want to be on is this one just here, layout and format. And if you take a look towards the bottom, one of the options that's automatically selected is auto fit column widths on update. And that is currently ticked. So in general, if I didn't want my columns to change width, I would make sure that I set them first to the width that I want them to be, and then I'd come in here and I would untick this little checkbox and click on OK. So now if I move some of my fields around, you'll see this take effect. So I'm going to grab sales channel and just drag it down to rows. Now take a look at column B. Can you see sum of total profit is slightly overlapping the boundary of that cell? And that is because it's not expanding to accommodate the widest item. You might be thinking to yourself, well, why on earth would I want to do that? Because I always want to accommodate the widest item. As I said, you will find as you go through Excel, there are certain situations where you will want to be able to control that, particularly if you have data next to your pivot table. So just be aware of that. I'm going to drag sales channel back to columns, and I'm actually going to go back to my options, and I'm just going to turn auto fit back on. Now, when I grab sales channel and drag it down, you can see that I don't have that problem. Everything auto fits nicely. Hello everyone and welcome back. In this section, we're going to start to talk about aggregation and grouping. And we're going to start out in this lesson by discussing the various different methods of aggregation available when you're working with pivot tables. Now, if you're not sure what I mean by aggregation, let me make that really clear. So currently we're looking at a pivot table and we've summarized it by a number of different fields. And if you remember, I mentioned that when you drag fields into this values area in the bottom right-hand corner, Excel is either going to sum or count depending on the type of field that you've dragged to this area. So currently it says in here sum of total profit. And that's exactly what I'm seeing in my pivot table. I'm seeing the sum of the total profit for each region broken down by item type, sales channel, and I can also filter it by order date. Now I can see that I do have a filter applied there. I'm going to switch that back to all by selecting everything, and now I have my totals. If I go back down to that values field in the bottom right hand corner and remove this field so that I have a blank pivot table report, again, if I drag that same field back down to values, you'll see it's going to do a sum. So by default in Excel, when you drag a field that contains numeric values, so numbers, into that values area, Excel is going to aggregate your numbers by doing a sum. If you drag a field that has text in it or dates, then it's going to do a count. So let's drag this out again to remove it. If, for example, I decided to drag the country field and the country field contains text into this values area, take a look at what I get now. Instead of doing a sum, it's doing a count of the countries. So I can see how many countries in my source data, in the different regions by item type and sales channel. So our data may aggregate in one of those two ways depending on the type of field that we've used. Now I'm going to remove this and I'm just going to put the total profit back into that area. Now sum and count aren't the only two Excel functions essentially that we can summarize our data by. We have some others in here as well which you might find useful. So what about, instead of seeing the sum of the total profit for each of these regions and item types, I want to see the average. Well, all I need to do is summarize my data by average. And I can do that in a couple of different ways. If I'm clicked in my pivot table, I can right-click my mouse, go down to Value Field Settings, and then you'll see in this little window that pops up, in the Summarize Values By area, I can choose the type of calculation that I want to use to summarize my data. So if I want to take a look at the average instead of the sum, I can choose that from the list, click on OK, and my numbers are now showing as averages. Another way that I can do this is by using that field in the Values area. You can see now it says Average of Total Profit. If I click the drop-down arrow, in that menu, I can also get to Value Field Settings this way, and maybe I want to see the maximum value in this range. Click on OK, and my pivot table updates. So this is definitely worth jumping into Value Field Settings and taking a look at the different calculations that you can use to summarize your data. You can see there is quite a few of them in there. We have those main Excel functions: sum, count, average, max, and min. And then we have some additional functions: product, count numbers, STT-dev, var, so on and so forth. And some of these get a little more specific, and I will say that you will mostly use the top 5 that you see in here: sum, count, average, max, and min. So it's definitely worth having a little play around with those so that you're seeing in your pivot table exactly the information that's relevant to your analysis. So now that we've seen how we can change how we're aggregating our data, let's talk a little bit about combining different methods of aggregation, because this is really going to open up your analysis and take it beyond the source data in your workbook. Now, to demonstrate this, I am going to make a couple of changes to this pivot table just to make it slightly less complex and easier for you to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove this filter, the order date filter, by dragging it outside the pivot table fields area. I'm also going to remove the sales channel from columns so I just have the total profit listed by region and item type. And I can see that currently I'm just showing the maximum of the total profit. So let's change that back to doing a sum. Remember, right-click your mouse down to Value Field Settings, change it to sum, and click on OK. Now what I'm going to do here to make this table a bit easier to read is I'm going to change these heading labels. And these are pretty simple to change. So for this one here, where it says row labels, now you can see why it says row labels as opposed to region or item type. And that's because we have both showing below here. We have the region and then we have the item type. So Excel doesn't really know what one you want to use for the heading, so it just says row labels. Now we can change that. I'm going to double click in this cell and I'm going to change this to region and hit enter. And I can also change this one just here. So where it says sum of total profit by default, if I double click, it's going to open up that value field settings box again. And I can choose a custom name at the top. So if this is a bit long, maybe I might just want it to say sum of profit. And click on OK to change that name. Now, one thing you'll notice is that if you do change the name of this heading, if you take a look over the pivot table fields in this values area, it's changed down here automatically. So it's updated to say sum of profit, the same as what it says in the pivot table. But the actual field just above is still called total profit. So just bear that in mind when you're working in your pivot table and renaming these headings. So now I can see the sum of the profit by region and by item type. But what if I also want to see the average of the profit? We've seen how we can change that by right-clicking, going to Value Field Settings and changing how we're summarizing our data. But if I select average from here, it basically replaces the sum of profit column with the average of profit column. Now that might be what I want to do in some scenarios, but sometimes I want to be able to see the sum and the average next to each other. So how do we do that? How do we combine these two together? Well, let's just take this back to sum, because all we need to do here is just add another total profit field to the values area. So we basically want to duplicate what we have in column B. So I'm going to go over to my pivot table fields, I'm going to grab total profit again, and I'm going to drag it down to values, which is basically going to give me a duplicated column. Remember, this one won't take on the new name. We would have to rename this one as well if we wanted it to match. But now that I have this in here, I can then summarize this specific column using a different calculation. So we're going to right click, summarize values by, and this time we're going to go to average. And now I can see both the sum and the average. Let's double click in the heading and just change that title to average of profit and hit enter. What about if now I also wanted to see the maximum profit by region and by item type? Again, I can grab the total profit field, drag it down to the values area. It gives me another column. I can right click, summarize values by, and I'm going to say max. Double click on that heading area and change the title to max of profit and hit enter. And I could carry on going. What if I wanted to grab something like unit price? I can grab that field and drag it down. By default, it's going to do a sum, which is absolutely fine. But if I wanted to see the minimum unit price this time, I could drag another one of those fields into that values area, right-click my mouse, summarize values by, min. Double click to change the title, and I'm just going to call this min of unit price and hit enter. So this kind of expands how we're able to use our source data. Because in my source data, I didn't have any columns which worked out the average of anything or the min or the max. But we can do that on the fly in our pivot table just by using that summarize by option that's available in the right-click menu. Now I have a bit too much going on here. I'm going to remove the last two that we just added, so min of unit price and sum of unit price, and leave myself with these three calculations. So now it's time for you to give this a go yourself, have a little play around, see how you feel, and then we'll move on to the next lesson. It's time now to move on and start talking about grouping and ungrouping pivot table data. And we've already come across grouping a little bit so far in this course, although we might not have realized it. Because Excel has automatically applied grouping to this pivot table when we added the item type into rows. So if you take a look down in the rows area of the pivot table fields, you can see that we have region and item type. Now notice currently, if we look at the pivot table, next to each of the regions, we have this little minus symbol. And that is basically grouping. If I was to remove item type from the pivot table fields rows area by dragging and dropping it, you can see that we just now have region, and those plus and minus symbols have disappeared because Excel no longer needs to group our data. As soon as we add item type back in, because we're now summarizing by two fields, Excel needs to group that data so we can see all of the item types for Asia, then Australia, so on and so forth. And Excel will do this fairly frequently depending on the field that you've dragged into one of the pivot table field areas. So let's drag another one in so you can see something slightly different when it comes to grouping. And for this example, I'm going to use a date field. So if I take a look over at all of my different fields, let's see, maybe I want to summarize by the order date. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag that down into the rows area and I'm going to place it above region. Take a look at my pivot table. Excel has automatically grouped my data by the order date. And I have those plus buttons next to each of those years. Take a look at what's going on down in this rows area. Remember, I simply dragged the order date field, so why do I have in this rows area years, quarters, and order date, along with my region and item type? Shouldn't I just really have order date in here? Where did years and quarters come from? Well, again, this is something that is automatic in Excel. What it does is when you drag something like a date down to an area, it looks at your data, your source data that is, and it says, how can I break this down in a way that's going to be most useful? So it's recognized that I have different years in my data, which I do, so it's given me a years field. It's also recognized that each year can be split up into quarters, so it's given me a quarters field as well. And I can now use these independently of the overall order date field. So let's expand 2010 by clicking on the plus. And now what I have underneath is quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4, because every year has 4 quarters. If I expand quarter 1, then I'm going to see all of my information. So now I can see quarter 1, January, for this region, and these item types. And it's going to go through each one of these for each month of the quarter. So my pivot table is going to end up being extremely large. If we scroll down, we then get to February and we have all of the same details. So it can get quite complex and quite detailed. So this is grouping in practice. Now, what if I look at this automatic grouping and I think to myself, you know what, this is a little bit of overkill. I'm not really interested in seeing these figures broken down by quarter, but I am interested in the year and the month. Well, what we can do is go down to our rows area and simply drag that quarters field out. And now I'm just going to get that summary by the year and then by each of the months. And these months are based on the order date in that sales data. And the same will be applied to all of the other years as well. We have January, if I scroll down, we then have February, so on and so forth. So we can really customize and determine how we want this data summarized. Now, if I click in the pivot table and go up to the pivot table analyze ribbon, you'll see that we have a group on this ribbon. And we have 3 options: group selection, ungroup, and group field. Now, if I click on Group Field, this is going to show you where that grouping comes from, where those additional fields come from. This is showing me where my data starts at. So again, it's looking at my source data. It's finding the first date in my source data, and then it's finding the last date in my source data. And then it says, okay, we've got data in between these 2 dates. I'm going to group them by months, quarters, and years. So this is where it's kind of pulling that level of detail from. If you wanted to, you could say, I never want to see the quarters, and deselect quarters so it always summarizes by month and years. It's really entirely up to you how you set that up. Now notice that it's expanded all of my different groups. Now I want to collapse them all back up. A quick way of doing that is to go up to this active field group, and you can see here we have a collapse field and an expand field button. So I'm going to choose collapse field just to take that back to how it was. I might even want to click on the year and collapse that up as well, so I can just see those years and then the sum of profit, average, and max. I could go a stage further here and I could go back down to my rows area and drag years out of rows, and then it's basically going to break that down by months across all of the different years. And remember, if you don't want to show these plus and minus buttons, if you kind of want to lock that down a little bit and just see these figures for each of the months, remember from the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon in that show group, you can choose to remove those plus and minus buttons. Now I'm going to turn mine back on just to bring those back. Now let's take a look at another example of grouping. And this is basically where you can create your own groups as opposed to Excel automatically creating them for you. So what I'm going to do is in this rows area down here, I'm going to remove order date. So we get back to how we were at the beginning of this lesson. So maybe I look at this data and I say to myself, for these item types, I actually want to create a group called food and drink. And then I want to have another group called other. Well, we can do that by creating our own groups. So what I would need to do here, if I want to create that first group, food and drink, I need to select all of the items that I want to include in that group. So that's going to include baby food, beverages, cereal, fruits, that's food and drink. So let's hold down Control and select that one as well. Meat, we can select that, and also snacks and vegetables. So those are all of the items that belong in the food and drink category or group. So to create that group, let's jump back up to the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon and select Group Selection. Notice now I have a new group and currently it's just called Group 1. So what I want to do here is I want to rename this food and drink. And the way that you need to do this is to make sure that you're clicked where it says Group 1 and press the F2 key. You can then backspace and rename it. So let's call it food and drink and hit enter. Now notice I've renamed this group, but if we take a look down in the rows area, we just have item type 2 just here, and that's exactly what this new field is. So if I want to rename this, I can click the drop down arrow, go to field settings, and I can give it a custom name of food and drink, just to keep everything consistent. Notice now that I've changed that, also in the active field area, the active field is showing as food and drink. So now I have that first group, I want everything else to go under the category of other. So let's select everything else, say group selection. I have a new group, I need to click in it and press F2. And we're going to call this other and hit enter. And once again, I want to make sure that the field matches what I have in the pivot table. And what I can do, just so I don't have to go all the way back down to the bottom right hand corner, is right click, field settings, and I can rename it up here as other and click on OK. And you'll see that now that field name has changed underneath rows and also in the active field area. And notice that it's applied that grouping structure to the rest of my data. So it's really quick and easy. If I'm just interested on the profit for Asia related to food and drink, I can basically collapse up everything else and just zone in on these figures just here. So that is how you can also create your own custom groups. Now let's just finish this lesson by doing the reverse and ungrouping our data. Notice in the group field just above, we have an ungroup button. So I'm currently clicked on food and drink. I'm going to select ungroup, and you can just click ungroup wherever you want to ungroup that data. So very nice and straightforward. So far as we've been working away in this pivot table, we haven't really paid too much attention to the number formatting that we're using. And number formatting is always going to make your numbers a lot easier to read. Now, when you build a pivot table, those numbers are going to be unformatted. And you can see here, because we haven't applied any number formatting, all of the numbers that we can see in our pivot table don't have any formatting applied. And you can see they are quite inconsistent when it comes to the number of decimal places being displayed. And we also don't have anything like a currency symbol to show what currency we're using. And a currency symbol always makes things a lot easier to read. Now, I'm going to assume that if you are an Excel user, you're probably well aware of how to apply number formatting. If not, let's just do a quick recap. I'm just going to type some numbers into these cells over here outside of the pivot table. Currently, those are plain whole numbers and they just have general formatting applied. If I wanted to display these as monetary values, I would need to change the formatting that's applied to these cells. And from here, I could choose either currency or accounting format. That's going to give me a consistent amount of decimal places and also the currency symbol. And if you don't want to use the dollar symbol, you can select the one that is more appropriate for your region from the drop down, jump into more accounting formats, and then you can choose your currency symbol from this big long list just here. So if you are used to doing that, you might think to yourself that that is going to be the method that you use when you want to apply the same thing in pivot tables. And what I would say to you is that that is definitely not the best method. Remember, pivot tables are not static, they're dynamic. The fields and the location of those fields is always moving depending on how we choose to pivot our data. And when you apply number formatting in the way that I just showed you, it applies that number formatting to the cell as opposed to the number. So if we were to use that method in this pivot table and maybe we decide to select this group here and apply number formatting from this home ribbon, that formatting will apply to the cell. If these fields then move around, that formatting isn't going to travel with the number. And in this case, I actually want it to do that. Wherever I have these number fields, I want that formatting to move with the number. So in order to make sure that that happens every single time, we apply our number formatting in a slightly different way. And it's a very simple way and means that we don't also have to go through and select every single number that we want to change the format of. So we want to make sure that we're clicked in one of the fields that contains a number that we need to format, we can right-click our mouse and you can see we have an option here called Number Format. Alternatively, you can get to this via Value Field Settings by clicking the Number Format button at the bottom. And it's going to take you into that Format Cells window, so this should look reasonably familiar if you are an Excel user. You can then go in and apply the number formatting that you want to use. So I'm going to use accounting formatting. I'm going to keep it on 2 decimal places. And I am going to use the US dollar currency symbol. Let's click on OK, click on OK again, and it's going to apply that number formatting to everything in this sum of profit column. And I now need to repeat this process for the other 2 columns. So we're going to right click, Number Format, Accounting, and OK. And we're going to do exactly the same thing, Value Field Settings, Number Format, Accounting, OK. And now we have that number formatting applied. So don't forget about that in your right-click menu, your number format options. Now, of course, you can also utilize the custom number formatting that you have at the bottom here if you want to get a little bit more granular, a little bit more customized about how these numbers are formatted. And custom number formatting is outside of the scope of this beginner's course, but I just wanted to highlight that in case you need to do something other than the standard symbol and decimal places formatting for these numbers. But in essence, it is as simple as that to apply number formatting to the values in your pivot table. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at how we can handle cells that contain no data. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to need to rearrange my pivot table fields very slightly. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab the country field and drag that into filters. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the average of profit and the max of profit columns. So let's grab both of these and drag them outside of the pivot table fields area so that we're just left with sum of profit. So currently what I'm displaying here is the sum of profit for all countries, all regions, and all item types. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this country filter and I'm just going to show the data for Albania. So let's select Albania, click on OK. So my pivot table has updated. What I'm going to do now is add another field. Let's add the sales channel into columns. So now I'm summarizing. I'm looking at the sum of profit for Albania by item type and sales channel, so offline or online. And what I could do here to make this a bit easier on myself is where it says column labels, I'm going to double click and I'm going to change this to say sales channel and hit enter. Now notice, now that I have my data arranged like this, I have a couple of empty cells. So I can see here that for these particular pieces of criteria, so for Albania, we don't have any details for online sales for household products. And the same thing applies to offline sales for snacks. We have 2 empty cells in here. Now you could keep those blank and then go on and continue analysing your data. But what's going to happen is if we would create something like a pivot chart, because we don't have anything in here, our pivot chart is going to look a little bit strange because if there's no data, it's going to be excluded entirely from the pivot chart. And sometimes you still want to be able to see that we have this item type there, but just that it's generated no sales. So a much better way of doing this, and a much better way of getting your analysis to look correct, is to replace all of these blanks with a 0. You don't necessarily have to have a 0, you could fill it with whatever you want. It's going to be the same method that you use. But let me show you how we can deal with these blanks. What I'm going to do is jump up to the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, and for this we need to go to this first group called Pivot Table. And we're going to jump into our Pivot Table options. Now we have lots of different tabs underneath here, but the one that we want to be on is this one here, Layout and Format. And if you take a look towards the bottom underneath this format group, you can see it says for empty cells show, and then currently we have nothing in there. We have blank, which is why we've got blank cells. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to replace the blank with a 0 and click on OK. And now you can see that it's added the dollar symbol and a dash. And if I look up in the formula bar, you can see that the actual value of this cell is 0. So effectively, there is now a value in both of those cells, and any pivot charts or analysis that we do will include this data. It's just going to show as 0. So I would recommend, possibly even before you start creating your pivot tables, to review what you have in this 4 empty cells area. And if you are going to be dealing with a lot of values and you want to be able to handle those empty cells, make sure that you come in here, you have a tick in the 4 empty cells box and add a 0 into this field. In this section of the course, we're going to move on to talking about the different layout options that we have for our pivot table. And we're going to start out in this lesson by talking about subtotals and grand totals. Now, something you might notice when you start dragging and dropping fields into these different areas is that Excel will automatically display subtotals and grand totals. And you can see that we have grand totals on our pivot table right now. We've got a column just here showing our grand totals and also one running across the bottom. What also isn't as obvious in this current layout that we have is that we do have subtotals as well. And the subtotals are listed at the top of each group. So here, because I'm just showing information for Albania, and that's within Europe, I have the subtotals listed at the top just here. And this becomes more obvious if we change the layout of our pivot table. So what I'm going to do is change this filter to show all countries. And now you can see the different subtotals. So here we have the subtotals for Asia. We then have the subtotals just here for Australia and Oceania, subtotals for Central America and the Caribbean, so on and so forth. We have our grand totals listed in the column, and if I press Control down arrow to jump to the bottom of this pivot table, I have the grand totals right at the bottom as well. Control up arrow to jump to the top. Now, this is all well and good. You might be perfectly happy seeing that information. Maybe you're interested in the grand totals and also the subtotals for each of the regions. But if you're not and you find that these are just getting in the way and making the pivot table more busy than it needs to be, then you can choose to remove them or only display them for rows or columns. So we're going to find all of these options for controlling our subtotals and grand totals on the Design tab. And it's in this first group here, Layout. So let's take a look at subtotals first of all. Now we have a few different options here. We can choose not to show subtotals at all. We can show them at the bottom of the group or at the top of the group. Now the default in Excel is to show subtotals at the top of the group, which is why we're seeing them up here. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think of a subtotal, I always think of it as being at the bottom of a group. That's just how I like to read my subtotals. So what I'm going to do here is click on the drop down and say show all subtotals at the bottom of the group. And to me, that makes a little bit more sense. I'm reading down my different items and then I get my subtotals here in row 18 for Asia. Now, of course, that is personal preference. If you like them at the top, you're more than welcome to keep them there. If you're not interested in those subtotals at all, then you can say do not show subtotals. It's going to get rid of them and your pivot table looks a little bit cleaner. We can do the same for grand totals. So back up to that layout group, if we click grand totals, we can turn them off for both rows and columns, on for rows and columns, on for rows only, or on for columns only. So if I say on for columns only, you can see it removes that grand total on the right hand side. But if I go all the way to the bottom of my pivot table, I still have it here because I left it on for columns. If I go back to grand totals and say off for rows and columns, it's going to get rid of it at the bottom and also on the right hand side. And I will say that in general, I tend to turn off both grand totals and subtotals if I'm creating a pivot chart on this data. Because in general, you don't want the totals included in your chart, so I find it's just easier to toggle those off and then they're not there getting in the way. So very straightforward and simple. I'm actually going to go back in and I'm going to turn on for rows and columns those grand totals, and I'm going to turn my subtotals on and show them at the bottom of the group. Another thing that we can do with our pivot tables is we can choose what we want our report layout to look like. And we have a few different options that we can choose from, each one of them slightly different. So again, this whole lesson is very much down to personal preference, how you like your report to look and how you find it easiest to read. Now for this, we're going to stay working on the design ribbon in the layout group. And the little button that we're going to use this time is report layout. And you can see that as I hover over it, the screen tip says adjust the report layout. The compact form optimizes for readability, while the tabular and outline forms include field headers. So what exactly does that mean? Well, if you remember, the last lesson we were taking a look at subtotals and grand totals, and I moved my subtotals to the bottom of the group. Now if I go up to report layout, the first option that I have here is to show my layout in compact form. Now take a look at what happens here. If I click it, it's basically going to move those subtotals back up to the top. And what compact form basically is the most compact way of viewing the data in your pivot table. So it's going to move those subtotals back up to the default, which is at the top, and it's also going to auto fit all of your column widths so that you're using the space you have within the pivot table most efficiently. It doesn't really change anything else. But one thing that it does do is that it maintains the grouping structure that you have in your pivot table. So with all that said, let's go back up to report layout and take a look at what happens if we decide to show in outline form. So let's click, and what do we get? Well, this isn't quite as compact as the last one. What it's actually done is it's moved this item type and put it in its own column. So instead of having these item types kind of grouped and listed underneath each region, it's given them their own column. So if you find your report a little bit easier to read in this way, because it is quite easy to see that this is Asia and then we have the item types, you could choose to use outline form view. Now remember, each of these views are customizable, so again, if you didn't like the subtotals at the top, you could then go in and say show all subtotals at bottom. You're still in the outline form view, but you just have those subtotals listed underneath. Now what if I decide that I quite like this layout? I like the item type being in its own separate column as opposed to underneath the region in column A. But what if I want the word Asia repeated on each line of this table? Well, again, we can do that from this report layout drop-down. You can see right at the bottom it says repeat all item labels. So what I could do is turn this on, and then I get Asia, Asia, Asia listed out here, and the same for the other regions. Now you might think that this makes it look a little bit too busy, and if you do, that's absolutely fine, but just know that that is an option, and there are some instances where you're going to need to do this to create certain types of chart. The one off the top of my head that I can think of is when you're creating a map chart. And we're going to get more onto that subject a little bit later on in the course. Now, if you do have all item labels repeating and you want to reverse that and turn them off, you can say do not repeat item labels, and it's going to go back to how it was. So now let's take a look at the final report layout that we have in here, and that is show in tabular form. And again, not a great deal changes here, but what we do have is we now have the grid lines added back into our pivot table. I don't know if you noticed that. If we undo and go back to the previous layout, take a look. It's just blank just here. We don't have the grid lines showing in our pivot table. But if we change that report layout to tabular form, we do get those grid lines. So to me, this means that the entire report looks less like a pivot table and more just like a regular Excel table or something that you've typed into the cells. And if you're somebody who likes to have these grid lines here because it enhances your readability, then tabular format might be the one that you want to choose. But the decision on which one you choose really is up to you. Just be aware that you have all three of these and they are all very slightly different. In this very quick little lesson, I just want to show you how you can add to the readability and spacing in your pivot table by adding blank rows. And for this, we are sticking on the design ribbon in that layout group. The final option that we haven't yet looked at in here is blank rows. And you can see what the screen tip says. It says emphasize groups by adding a blank line between each grouped item. So this applies to the grouping that you have within your pivot table. So what grouping do I have? Well, currently I am grouping my information by the region. That is why I have these little plus and minus symbols next to them. So what I could choose to do here is click on the blank rows drop down, and I can choose to insert a blank line after each item. Now when I click this, you'll see that I just get a blank row in between the first group and the second group. So it kind of separates them out and makes it a little bit easier to read and see. And this will apply throughout the entire pivot table. So if I scroll down, there's going to be a blank line in between each piece of group data. Now, if I was to make a change to this pivot table so that I have more than one group, for example, if I add the sales channel and drag and drop it down into the rows area, you can see that blank line is going to continue through, and it's also going to add a blank row after each item type. So just remember when you're doing this, the blank row is going to appear after the grouped items. And currently we're looking at our data in that tabular view. If I change my report layout and go back to compact view, you can see there is the blank row in exactly the same place. Now I'm going to switch back to tabular view. And if you want to remove those blank rows, remember you can click that blank rows drop down and remove that blank line after each grouped item. Now I actually do want one in there, so I'm going to put that back. But it is as simple as that.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Says It.